Please tell me in the comments from where you are watching and at what time are you watching, and please leave a like and subscribe the channel. It will be a lot of support. Thank you. The Ottoman Empire's extraordinary journey began in one of the most unstable and transformative periods of medieval history. The late 13th century was a time of imperial collapse, mass migrations, and shifting loyalties across Anatolia, a crossroads of civilizations situated between the decaying Byzantine Empire to the west and the collapsing Seljuk Sultanate of Rum to the east. Into this power vacuum emerged a mosaic of Turkic principalities called beyliks, led by chieftains, many of whom were the descendants of Oghuz Turkic tribes who had migrated from Central Asia following the Mongol invasions. Among them was a relatively minor leader named Osman, son of Ertugrul, the head of the Kayi tribe, one of the branches of the Oghuz Confederation. It was Osman who would lay the ideological and political groundwork for a dynasty that would endure for more than 6 centuries and span 3 continents. Yet, at its inception, the Ottoman state was anything but imperial. It was an ambitious, agile warrior polity, formed in the crucible of frontier life and driven by a potent mix of opportunism, religious fervor, and cultural flexibility. Osman's early realm was situated in the region of Bithynia, bordering the Byzantine frontier, a region riddled with abandoned forts, depopulated villages, and forgotten roads. The Byzantine state had lost control of much of its Anatolian territory, and its local governors were often left to defend themselves against Turkic raiders and their ever-expanding beyliks. Osman, like many other Ghazi leaders, began by leading raiding parties against nearby Byzantine strongholds, positioning himself as a champion of Islamic holy war Gaza. Though this identity was likely more symbolic and pragmatic than strictly theological in its early form, the Ghazi ethos appealed to both devout Muslims and ambitious fighters seeking wealth and prestige, attracting a broad coalition of supporters. His followers were not exclusively Turkic or Muslim. Many were Greek converts, Christians, Persianized elites, and Sufi mystics, forming a cosmopolitan warrior society bound together by loyalty to their leader, plunder, and the promise of land. This fusion of cultures and ideologies was not accidental. It was a hallmark of Osman's genius. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not impose rigid ethnic or religious purity upon his domain. Instead, he integrated local Byzantine populations, offering them security and autonomy in exchange for loyalty and taxes. His administrative approach was pragmatic. Rather than erase the past, he co-opted it. Byzantine bureaucrats, Greek-speaking clergy, and even local landlords were incorporated into the emerging Ottoman state structure. This early form of governance set the precedent for the empire's flexible and inclusive rule, which would later allow it to govern Christians, Jews, and Muslims across vast territories. Osman's political acumen was matched by his keen sense of symbolic authority. Chroniclers later attributed a mystical dream to him, one in which a tree grew from his chest, its branches covering the world, symbolizing divine favor and the inevitable rise of his house. Though likely mythologized after the fact, such legends reflect how deeply Osman's legacy was rooted in both spiritual destiny and historical legitimacy. By the early 14th century, Osman's territory expanded through persistent warfare and careful alliances. One of his most strategic moves was the siege and eventual capture of key Byzantine towns, especially Yenisahir, which became the new military and administrative base for further expansion. As his domain grew, so did the complexity of governance. Though still referred to as a beylik, the Ottoman polity began to show signs of institutional development rudimentary taxation systems, localized administration, and the beginnings of a centralized military structure, Osman's son Orhan was already taking on leadership duties, and the seeds of dynastic continuity were being planted. Osman's final years were consumed with the siege of Bursa, a wealthy and fortified Byzantine city nestled at the foot of Mount Uladak, though Osman likely died before its final capture in 1326. The victory is credited to his reign and considered a definitive turning point in Ottoman history. With Bursa as their capital, the Ottomans transformed from a mobile warrior confederation into a territorial Islamic principality, capable of collecting taxes, issuing coinage, and maintaining permanent institutions. Osman was buried just outside the city, his tomb becoming a site of Ottoman pilgrimage and political symbolism for centuries to come. In hindsight, Osman's role in history is magnified not only by what he achieved during his lifetime, but by the remarkable trajectory his descendants would pursue. What he created was not just a state, it was a model of resilience, an adaptable political organism rooted in the chaos of the frontier, shaped by both violence and diplomacy, and guided by a vision that far exceeded its modest origins. His leadership marked the beginning of a 600-year imperial saga that would witness the fall of Constantinople, the siege of Vienna, the golden age of Islamic art and architecture, and the rise of a multi-ethnic empire that ruled over tens of millions. But in 1299, none of this was foretold. There was only a small band of warriors, a charismatic leader, and a crumbling world ready to be reimagined. Osman's genius was not just in conquest, it was in building something enduring from the ruins of others. With Osman's passing and the capture of Bursa in 1326, leadership of the burgeoning Ottoman polity passed to his son Orhan Gazi, whose reign would transform the Beylik from a warrior confederation into a nascent state. Orhan's genius did not lie merely in conquest, but in institutionalization, the establishment of lasting structures that could govern not only tribal warriors but urban populations, diverse religions, and complex economies. Under Orhan, the Ottomans introduced coinage bearing his name, marking the beginning of a distinct Ottoman fiscal and symbolic authority. Bursa became more than just a capital, it became a center of Islamic governance, trade, and architecture, with mosques, bazaars, and educational institutions rising from its hills. The move from mobile camp to urban seat of power signaled a transition from tribal authority to dynastic statecraft. Orhan's expansion into the formerly Byzantine territories was characterized not by destruction, but by strategic accommodation. With the Byzantine Empire crumbling and civil wars erupting in Constantinople, Orhan seized the opportunity to both extend his military reach and entrench his legitimacy through diplomacy. In a striking example of political maneuvering, he married Theodora, the daughter of Byzantine Emperor John VI Kantakasinos, intertwining Ottoman interests with the fractured Byzantine court. This alliance provided not only symbolic prestige but also tangible access to European territories. It was during Orhan's rule that the Ottomans made their first permanent foray into Europe. Gallipoli. In 1354, a devastating earthquake had depopulated the city, and Ottoman forces moved in under the pretense of assistance, establishing a strategic foothold on the Thracian peninsula. From this base, the Ottomans began their methodical expansion into the Balkans, encountering both resistance and opportunity in the divided Christian kingdoms of the region. This European expansion accelerated under Murad I, Orhan's son, whose reign from 1362 to 1389 would redefine the scope and structure of Ottoman power. Murad moved the capital further into Europe, to the city of Adrianople, a symbolic act that proclaimed the empire's permanent presence in Europe. But it wasn't only geography that changed, it was also the military and administrative machinery of the state. Recognizing the limitations of a tribal-based army, Murad formalized the devshirme system, a human levy drawn from Christian villages in the Balkans. Boys taken through this system were converted to Islam, rigorously trained, and placed in elite administrative or military roles, especially in the newly formalized Janissary Corps, a professional standing army loyal directly to the Sultan. The Janissaries were revolutionary, disciplined, salaried, ideologically indoctrinated, and militarily superior to the feudal levies of Europe, or the tribal cavalries of the East. This fusion of forced recruitment and elite status created a deeply loyal and ethnically diverse ruling class that became a cornerstone of Ottoman governance. Murad's success was not confined to bureaucracy. He decisively confronted the fractious Balkan states, winning pivotal battles such as Maritsa 1371, where a vastly outnumbered Ottoman force annihilated a Serbian-led coalition, and ultimately the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. Kosovo, though ending with Murad's death allegedly at the hands of a Serbian assassin, marked the beginning of Ottoman political dominance in the Balkans. The symbolism of this battle resonated for centuries in both Ottoman and Balkan cultural memory. It also revealed something essential about Murad's statecraft. He blended force with flexibility, terror with tolerance. While he levied taxes and troops from conquered Christians, he often allowed local rulers to retain their thrones in exchange for tribute and loyalty. This system of vassalage and autonomy gave the Ottomans stability in newly conquered regions and minimized resistance. Murad was buried in Bursa, beside his grandfather Osman, but his true legacy was institutional. He left behind a military administrative complex powerful enough to challenge kingdoms and stable enough to endure dynastic transition. By the end of Murad's reign, the Ottoman state had undergone a profound metamorphosis. From a Ghazi-led beylik, it had become a centralized proto-empire, boasting a standing army, a tributary network in both Asia and Europe, and a population that was religiously and ethnically diverse, but politically integrated. It had Islamic scholars issuing legal rulings in Bursa, Christian noblemen submitting tribute from Serbia, and slaves of the state rising to become generals and viziers. And yet, the greatest chapter, the conquest of Constantinople and the self-declaration as empire, still lay ahead. The Ottomans were no longer simply surviving on the frontier. They were positioning themselves to become the inheritors of empire, a new Rome rising not from within but from the outer edges of a collapsing world. The death of Murad I on the battlefield of Kosovo in 1389 marked a solemn but defining moment in Ottoman history. Power passed immediately to his son Bazid I, known as Yildirim or the Thunderbolt, a title earned from his lightning-fast military campaigns and iron-willed disposition. Bazid ascended the throne not merely as a tribal ruler or provincial strongman, but with the air of imperial purpose. He broke with tradition by declaring himself Sultan, a title that carried with it the weight of Islamic caliphate legitimacy and worldly kingship. Bazid's reign 1389 to 1402 signaled the Ottoman transformation into a truly ambitious, trans-regional power, unrelenting in its expansion and unapologetic in its imperial style. His rule began with swift consolidation in the Balkans, forcing Serbia into vassalage and solidifying Ottoman hegemony over the remnants of independent Balkan principalities. He then turned his gaze inward, across Anatolia, where rival Turkic Beyliks still resisted Ottoman supremacy. In rapid succession, Bayezid defeated, subdued, or absorbed these independent principalities: Karamanidis, Ejinidis, Saruhanidis, incorporating them into a centralized Ottoman administration. For the first time, Anatolia had a ruler who approached imperial unity. Bayezid was not content with regional consolidation. His reign would be marked by symbolic gestures designed to establish Ottoman spiritual and political dominance. He sought and secured recognition from the Abbasid Caliph in Cairo, bolstering the Ottomans' Islamic legitimacy. He also constructed mosques, madrasis, Islamic schools, and imperial complexes in cities like Bursa and Edon, showcasing a commitment not just to governance but to public religiosity, urbanization, and institutional continuity. His military acumen was unmatched in his generation. The defining triumph came in 1396 at the Battle of Nicopolis, where a vast Christian Crusader army, composed of knights from France, Hungary, and the Holy Roman Empire, launched a coordinated assault to halt Ottoman advance in Europe. Bayezid's forces decimated the Crusaders. The victory sent shockwaves across Europe, instilling fear of an Ottoman tide that seemed unstoppable. By the early 15th century, Bayezid had surrounded the fabled city of Constantinople, the decaying jewel of Byzantine civilization, laying siege to it and tightening the Ottoman noose. Had fate not intervened, Constantinople might have fallen decades earlier. But fate had other plans, and they came in the form of a storm from the East Timor, the Turkomangul warlord who ruled a vast empire stretching from India to the Caucasus. Timur saw Bayezid's growing power and pan-Islamic claims as a threat to his own dominion and legitimacy. The clash between these two titans culminated in the catastrophic Battle of Ankara in 1402. Bayezid, overextended, arrogant, and poorly positioned, suffered a humiliating defeat. He was captured alive, an unthinkable outcome for a reigning Muslim sovereign, and died in captivity months later. The Ottoman realm, deprived of its head, fractured. The ensuing interregnum 1402-1413 plunged the empire into civil war as Bayezid's sons, Suleiman, Isa, Musa, and Mem battled each other for supremacy. During this fratricidal decade, the Ottomans lost swathes of territory, prestige, and stability. Vassal states in the Balkans broke free, Anatolian beyliks reasserted independence, and rivals encroached upon Ottoman claims. To outsiders, it seemed, the empire might collapse entirely, just as quickly as it had risen. Yet what followed was perhaps even more astonishing than Bayezid's expansion. The resilience of the Ottoman political system. Despite the absence of a formal constitution or succession law, the dynasty endured. Local administrators, military leaders, and court factions upheld the essential framework of Ottoman governance. Cities like Bursa and Edorn remained administrative centers. Taxation continued. The Janissary cause held fast. After a decade of brutal infighting, Mehmed I emerged victorious and re-established central control. Known to history as the Restorer, Mehmed reunited the fractured territories and reasserted Ottoman dominance both in Europe and Anatolia. Though his reign was brief, it was critical. The survival of the Ottoman dynasty through the interregnum crisis proved that what Osman and his descendants had created was not merely a tribal dominion, but a state built to outlast individual rulers, with institutional roots deep enough to survive decapitation. The Ottoman Empire stood on the cusp of greatness once more. By 1413, the Ottomans had not only recovered from one of the most dangerous crises in their early history, they had matured. No longer just raiders or conquerors, they had become administrators, urban planners, theologians, diplomats, and imperial builders. They had crafted an identity that fused Turkic warrior ethos with Islamic statecraft and Byzantine administrative sensibilities, and most importantly, they had positioned themselves as heirs to the idea of empire, merely as successors to the Seljuks or rivals to the Byzantines, but as a new civilizational force. What began with Osman on the frontiers of Anatolia was now preparing to shape the world stage, and on the horizon loomed Mehmed II, a teenage prince with an imperial vision whose ambition would shock Christendom and reshape Eurasia forever. When Mehmed II ascended the throne in 1451 at the age of 19, few could have predicted the seismic impact his reign would have on world history. He had already briefly ruled in his early teens, following the death of his father, Murad II, but was then removed by court elites who doubted his readiness to govern. His return to power was not simply a second chance, it was a calculated transformation. Mehdi had spent his youth surrounded by the best tutors of the Islamic world, mastering Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, philosophy, and science. He was equally devoted to the study of military strategy, statecraft, and imperial history. But his ambition towered above mere scholarship. He had one vision fixed firmly in his mind: the conquest of Constantinople, the once glorious capital of the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, a city that had resisted centuries of siege and remained a symbolic thorn in the side of the Muslim world. For Mehmed, taking Constantinople was not only a military objective, it was a divine mission, a fulfillment of a prophecy attributed to the Prophet Muhammad: "Verily, you shall conquer Constantinople." What a wonderful leader will her conqueror be! Mehmed believed himself to be that leader. The city, by the mid-15th century, was a shadow of its former imperial self. The Byzantine Empire had long since been reduced to little more than Constantinople itself and a handful of surrounding territories. Its defences, however, remained formidable. The Theodosian walls, a triple-layered defence system, had repelled attackers for over 1,000 years. Yet Mehdi prepared not only to overcome them, he prepared to annihilate their very idea of invincibility. Upon becoming Sultan, he immediately began to lay the groundwork for a siege that would surpass anything the medieval world had ever seen. He negotiated peace treaties with European powers to prevent intervention, consolidated Anatolian territory to ensure a secure rear, and then commissioned the building of Rumeli Hisari, a massive fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus, directly across from the older Anadolu Hisar. Together, these fortresses allowed him to control all naval traffic entering the city, effectively cutting off any aid from the Black Sea. At the same time, he enlisted the services of Urban, a Hungarian engineer who constructed for him the basilica cannon, an enormous bombard capable of firing stone projectiles over a mile in distance. With military innovation, geopolitical cunning, and religious zeal, Mehmed prepared to deliver the final blow to the heart of Byzantium. By the spring of 1453, Mehmed had assembled a force of nearly 80,000 men, a navy of over 100 ships, and a siege train unlike anything Europe had ever faced. The Byzantines, under the leadership of the last emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, could muster fewer than 8,000 defenders. Greeks, Venetians, Genoese, and mercenaries united in desperation. The siege began in early April, and what followed was a campaign of both brute force and genius engineering. Day after day, Ottoman cannons pounded the ancient walls, cracking the uncrackable. When the Byzantines blockaded the Golden Horn with a heavy chain, Mehmed ordered his ships hauled overland across the hills behind Galata, launching them back into the harbour behind enemy lines, astonishing logistical feat. Over weeks of unrelenting bombardment, attempted escalades, tunnels, and naval skirmishes, Constantinople held, but barely, and then, on May 29, 1453, in a final, coordinated assault, Mehmed unleashed his full army. After hours of bloodshed, the Ottoman banner flew above the city walls. Constantine XI fought to the end, reportedly dying sword in hand amidst his men. The Byzantine Empire was no more. For the first time since Rome split in the 4th century, Constantinople had fallen. It had fallen to a 21-year-old Muslim emperor whose empire was only just beginning. The conquest of Constantinople was not the end of Mehmed II's ambition, it was the beginning of a radical transformation. On May 29, 1453, as the dust of battle settled and the corpses lay scattered at the base of shattered walls, Mehmed the Conqueror entered the city not merely as a warrior triumphant, but as a ruler of vision. Riding through the Carisius Gate, he dismounted at the Hagia Sophia, once the grandest church in Christendom. With solemnity, he ordered its conversion into a mosque, symbolically asserting that this was no sacking by barbarians, it was a transfer of civilization. Yet he also forbade widespread looting, protected Christian residents from massacre, and declared that the city would become the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. No longer a decaying ghost of Rome's past, Constantinople would rise again, reimagined as Istanbul, a cosmopolitan Islamic imperial capital, fusing East and West under Ottoman stewardship. The city he inherited was ruined. Centuries of decline, war, and siege had reduced its population to a mere fraction of its former million-strong glory. Many districts were deserted, infrastructure was decaying, and food shortages were rampant. Mehmed launched an aggressive repopulation and rebuilding campaign. He offered incentives to Muslims, Christians, and Jews from across the empire to resettle in the city, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes forcibly. Craftsmen, scholars, merchants, and farmers were granted land and tax exemptions. Former Byzantine nobles were incorporated into the new administration, while Greek Orthodox clergy were given protection under the newly installed Patriarch of Constantinople, reaffirming the empire's millet system, which allowed non-Muslim communities to manage their own religious and civil affairs under imperial oversight. In doing so, Mehmed positioned himself not just as a Muslim sultan, but as the successor to the Roman Caesars, claiming continuity, not rupture. Architecturally and symbolically, Mehmed transformed the city with feverish intensity. He commissioned the construction of Topkapi Palace, the imperial residence and administrative heart of the empire. Overlooking the Bosphorus and Golden Horn, he restored roads, aqueducts, and markets, rebuilt mosques and madrasas, and sponsored an emerging class of Ottoman intellectuals, jurists, poets, and scientists. Istanbul was no longer a city of ruins, it was a city of learning and law. Mehmed envisioned his capital as a universal city, one that would rival and surpass the metropolises of antiquity. He supported Persian, Arabic, and Turkish literary production and imported scholars from Cairo, Shiraz, and Central Asia to help forge a multilingual, multicultural court that fused Islamic ideals with Greco-Roman legacies. His respect for the sciences and classical philosophy stood alongside his commitment to Sunni orthodoxy, revealing a ruler deeply invested in both divine justice and imperial grandeur. Yet, Mehmed's efforts were not confined to aesthetics or administration. His legal reforms were sweeping. He codified Ottoman laws into what became known as the Kanun-i Osman, a legal code that balanced Sharia Islamic law with Qanun, customary sultanic decrees, setting a precedent for how Ottoman law would operate for centuries. These codes addressed land tenure, taxation, military obligations, and urban governance, creating a uniform legal system across a rapidly growing empire. His commitment to justice and order gave him not just the title of Fatih the Conqueror, but of Padishah, imperial sovereign, drawing comparisons not only to past Islamic rulers, but to Alexander the Great and Caesar Augustus. The conquest of Constantinople had given him the crown, but the reconstruction of Istanbul gave him an imperial soul. Through methodical planning, cultural brilliance, and political pragmatism, Mehmed II did not merely conquer a city, he revived an ancient world under a new, Islamic, Ottoman banner. While the conquest and reconstruction of Constantinople firmly established Mehmed II as a world historical figure, he was far from content to rest on symbolic victories. His imperial vision was dynamic, restless, and territorial. With Istanbul, now the resplendent heart of the empire, Mehmed turned his focus to expanding Ottoman dominance across 3 continents. His ambition knew few limits. He envisioned himself as both the world's Muslim emperor and the true heir to Rome, claiming universal authority over East and West. To this end, his military campaigns in Europe, Asia, and even into the Mediterranean islands became relentless, calculated, and brutally effective. In the Balkans, Mehmed built upon the foundations laid by his predecessors, but sought far greater reach. He crushed the remaining Serbian principalities, defeated the Hungarians, and annexed Bosnia in 1463, incorporating its Slavic Christian population under Ottoman rule. Unlike the devastation left by Western Crusades, Ottoman conquest often preserved local elites and allowed religious communities to maintain autonomy through the millet system, so long as they paid taxes and swore loyalty. In Albania, he faced fierce resistance from Skanderbeg, a Christian leader who became a legendary figure in European resistance law. Mehmed's repeated campaigns into Wallachia and Moldavia brought him into conflict with another formidable opponent, Vlad III Dracula, known in legend as Vlad the Impaler, whose methods of resistance were as savage as the campaigns that sought to crush them. These encounters shaped Mehmed's image in the West. He was both feared as a ruthless conqueror and respected as a formidable, intelligent sovereign whose armies seemed as inexhaustible as his will. In Anatolia and the East, Mehmed targeted the remaining Turkic Beyliks and the powerful Karamanids, seeking to unify Muslim Anatolia under Ottoman rule. By systematically dismantling rival Turkic dynasties and asserting imperial sovereignty over fragmented regions, Mehmed forged an internal unity that was critical to the empire's longevity. His annexation of the Empire of Trebizond in 1461, one of the last Byzantine successor states, finally erased the Byzantine political presence from Anatolia. In doing so, Mehmed declared Ottoman supremacy not just as a religious power, but as the undisputed inheritor of the Eastern Roman world. He also projected power into the Aegean and Mediterranean, conquering Lesbos, Euboea, and parts of the Peloponnese, tightening Ottoman control over vital maritime trade routes and threatening the Venetian and Genoese trading networks. His naval ambitions prompted a vast expansion of the Ottoman fleet and the construction of new shipyards along the Bosphorus. The Ottomans, under Mehmed, were no longer just a land empire. They were becoming a naval force with imperial intent across seas beyond war and administration. Mehmed's reign is remembered for laying the blueprint of Ottoman absolutism. He centralized power around the Sultanate, curbed the independence of the Turkic military aristocracy, and enhanced the role of the devshirme-based bureaucracy, eunuchs, janissaries, and grand viziers, often drawn from Christian converts who owed their lives and loyalties to the palace. The imperial court was refined into a meticulously managed system of hierarchy, protocol, and ritual, modeled on both Islamic traditions and Byzantine ceremonial grandeur. Mehmed personally oversaw cultural patronage, commissioning scholars to translate ancient Greek texts into Arabic and Turkish, building madrasis that taught astronomy and logic alongside Quranic law, and encouraging Persianate court culture in literature and art. He saw no contradiction in being a Muslim warrior who quoted Aristotle and sought to harmonize Plato's philosophy with Islamic governance. His court became a rare blend of orthodox faith and classical intellect. And he himself, a man who penned Persian poetry under the pseudonym Avni, embodied this synthesis. When Mehmed II died in 1481, likely of illness, while preparing for yet another campaign, possibly against Rhodes or even Italy, the empire was stunned. His funeral procession carried the body of a man who had fundamentally reshaped the Islamic world, destroyed a 1,000-year-old empire, birthed one of the greatest cities in the world, and left behind an Ottoman state that had evolved from a beylik of Ghazis into a centralized, multicultural, militarized empire with imperial ambitions stretching across continents. His legacy endured not merely in stone or conquests, but in the systems, symbols, and structures that would allow his successors to become the sovereigns of Islam and Europe alike. Later generations of Sultan Suleiman, the magnificent chief, among them would invoke Mehmed's name not only as a founder of cities, but as the true architect of empire. He was not just Mehmed the conqueror. He was the imperial visionary, the sword and pen of Ottoman destiny, and the bridge between medieval ambition and early modern sovereignty. The death of Mehmed II in 1481 triggered another period of dynastic uncertainty, as his sons Bayezid II and Sem Sultan contested the throne in a bitter struggle that threatened to unravel the empire's fragile succession norms. While Mehmed had built a sophisticated state, he left behind no clear laws of succession, a recurring theme in Ottoman history. The ensuing civil war ended with Bayezid's victory, but not without cost. Sem fled to Rhodes, then to Europe, where he became a pawn in the hands of the Pope and Christian monarchs eager to exploit Ottoman weakness. Bayezid II's reign, 1481 to 1512, was therefore marked by consolidation and stabilization. Though less militarily ambitious than his father, Bayezid focused on rebuilding after years of warfare, strengthening the empire's bureaucracy, and promoting scholarship, trade, and religious harmony. A devout Muslim and patron of the arts, Bayezid fostered a cultural renaissance, encouraging calligraphy, architecture, and religious learning, and earning the title the Just. Yet his moderate tone did not protect him from internal threats. His sons vied for power as he aged, and eventually, in a brutal dynastic pattern that would become common, Bayezid was forced to abdicate in favor of his aggressive and uncompromising son. Salim, the first Salim I, known as Yavuz or the Grim, ruled for just 8 years, 1512 to 1520, but his impact was tectonic. Where his father had been a patron, Salim was a conqueror, unapologetically driven by power and religious zeal. He inherited a secure empire and expanded it into a caliphate. His reign was dominated by 2 momentous campaigns, one against the Safavid Empire in Persia, and the other against the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt. In 1514, Selim launched an ambitious offensive into eastern Anatolia and Iran, confronting the Shia Safavid dynasty under Shah Ismail at the Battle of Chal. This was not only a territorial war, but a sectarian crusade, as Selim positioned himself as the defender of Sunni Islam against the Safavid brand of militant Shiism. The Ottomans crushed the Safavids, using superior artillery and tactics, and established dominance over eastern Anatolia. This battle marked the beginning of the Ottoman-Safavid rivalry, which would shape Middle Eastern geopolitics for centuries. But Selim's most astonishing achievement came in the next few years, when he turned his armies toward the Arab heartlands. In 1516 to 1517, Selim led a rapid and devastating campaign against the Mamluks, the rulers of Syria and Egypt. In two major battles, Marj Dabik and Ridnia Selim's forces decimated the Mamluk armies and marched into Damascus, Cairo, and the Hejaz, home to the Islamic holy cities of Mecca and Medina. These victories brought the Ottomans control over the Red Sea, the Nile Valley, and the Hejaz, securing key trade routes and religious legitimacy. Most significantly, Selim claimed the title of Caliph, transferring the symbolic leadership of the Islamic world from the Abbasids, who had long been ceremonial figureheads in Cairo, to the Ottoman sultans. This moment fused imperial authority with spiritual leadership, elevating the Ottomans above all other Muslim dynasties. Selim returned to Istanbul in triumph, bringing with him the Holy Mantle, the Prophet's sword, and other sacred relics, making the Ottoman court not only the seat of empire, but the spiritual center of Sunni Islam. Despite his immense victories, Selim's rule was marked by ruthlessness and suspicion. He ordered the execution of thousands of Shia Muslims in Anatolia. Fearing Safavid infiltration, he ruled with absolute authority, tightly centralizing power around the Sultanate and relying on a strong bureaucracy led by his trusted Grand Viziers and Janissaries. He died suddenly in 1520, likely of illness, and left behind a vastly expanded empire filled with both opportunity and risk. His death ushered in the reign of his son, Suleiman, a man of starkly different temperament, more cultured, more strategic, and destined to become the greatest Ottoman sultan. The stage was now set for the empire's golden age. When Suleiman I ascended the throne in 1520, the Ottoman Empire was already a formidable power, controlling vast territories across Asia, Europe, and Africa. Yet under his rule, the empire would reach a pinnacle of military, administrative, legal, and cultural brilliance that would earn him a place among the most powerful monarchs in history. Known in the Islamic world as Kanuni, the lawgiver, and in Europe as Suleiman the Magnificent, his reign would stretch for nearly half a century. He was not only a conqueror of cities and nations, but a profound statesman, poet, and patron of the arts, whose influence would echo across the Muslim and Christian worlds alike. He embodied both imperial majesty and intellectual depth, ruling over a court that rivaled the grandeur of the Caesars. While engaging in theological debate and composing Persian and Ottoman Turkish verse, Suleiman's reign began with an immediate display of military might. In 1521, he captured Belgrade, a vital fortress on the Danube that had eluded his grandfather, Mehmed II. This conquest opened the door to Central Europe and sent tremors through the Habsburg monarchy. A year later, he turned his gaze toward the Mediterranean and captured Rhodes, a stronghold of the Knights Hospitaller after a brutal siege. These early victories established Suleiman not merely as a defender of the Ottoman realm, but as a dynamic, an aggressive emperor willing to extend the frontiers of Islam and imperial power alike. But it was his 1526 campaign that would become legendary. At the Battle of Mohex, Suleiman's armies annihilated the Hungarian forces in one of the most decisive engagements in European history. The King of Hungary, Louis II, drowned while fleeing the battlefield, and the kingdom collapsed into political chaos. giving the Ottomans influence over Hungary for decades to come. This battle cemented Suleiman's dominance in southeastern Europe, bringing Ottoman forces dangerously close to Vienna itself. In 1529, Suleiman laid siege to Vienna, the gateway to Central Europe and the heart of Habsburg power. Though the siege failed due to inclement weather, logistical limitations, and stiff resistance, the very fact that the Ottomans had reached Vienna demonstrated the geopolitical reach of Suleiman's empire. The Western imagination began to see the Ottomans not just as a Muslim empire but as an existential force, capable of toppling Christendom's most prestigious dynasties. Despite the setback at Vienna, Suleiman remained undefeated in major campaigns. He continued to press the Habsburgs and their allies, forging a network of alliances and rivalries across Europe. Notably, he formed a strategic partnership with Francis I of France, a Catholic monarch, against the Habsburg Emperor Charles V, the pragmatic, if scandalous, alliance that revealed the flexibility of Ottoman diplomacy. Suleiman was not only feared as a conqueror but increasingly respected as a rational and calculating sovereign, engaging with the intricate balance of European power politics while never losing sight of his Islamic legitimacy. While his armies marched across Europe and the Middle East, Suleiman also expanded Ottoman power at sea. He elevated the legendary corsair Hayreddin Barbarossa to Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, challenging Venetian and Spanish naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. Under Suleiman's patronage, the Ottoman navy won major victories such as the Battle of Preveza 1538, which established Ottoman control over the eastern Mediterranean for decades. His influence extended to North Africa, where Ottoman authority was acknowledged from Algiers to Tripoli. In the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, Suleiman sought to challenge Portuguese dominance by dispatching fleets to Aden, Gujarat, and Hormuz, though with limited long-term success. Nevertheless, his reign marked the globalization of Ottoman strategic reach. Stretching from the gates of Vienna to the coasts of India, Suleiman's vision of empire was not bounded by continental barriers. He imagined the Ottomans as rulers of both land and sea, an empire as expansive in culture and law as it was in territory. But the sword was only half the story. At the heart of Suleiman's legacy lay a profound legal and administrative transformation that restructured the empire for centuries to come. We'll explore that in the next part, how he earned the title Kanuni and became not just a warrior of the sword, but a master of the pen. While Suleiman's military victories filled the chronicles of his time, it was his legal and administrative genius that earned him the enduring title Kanuni, the lawgiver in the Islamic world. His reign marked a pivotal point in Ottoman statecraft, where conquest gave way to consolidation, an age in which the vast empire was unified not only by might, but by law, structure, and culture. The territories under his rule spanned 3 continents and dozens of ethnic, linguistic, and religious groups. To govern such a complex body, Suleiman enacted a systematic codification of laws that balanced Islamic jurisprudence, Sharia, with practical, state-enforced laws, Qanun, producing a legal synthesis that gave the Ottoman Empire its long-term internal stability. Suleiman inherited an imperial system already evolving toward centralization, but he refined and institutionalized it with the help of his brilliant Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha. He overhauled the Kanun-i Osman, the Book of Laws of the House of Osman, clarifying judicial procedure, tax systems, land ownership, criminal law, and the rights of different religious communities. Crucially, Suleiman's laws were not in conflict with Sharia, but served as supplements or clarifications, addressing areas where religious law was silent or ambiguous. This allowed the Sultan to govern a secular bureaucracy without alienating religious scholars or clerics, creating a dual system in which judges Qadis implemented both Sharia and imperial law in tandem. His legal reforms brought uniformity across provinces, curtailed corruption, limited the arbitrary authority of provincial governors, and protected peasants from exploitation, thus ensuring economic productivity and loyalty from the rural masses. The Ottoman administrative structure during Suleiman's reign became a model of early modern efficiency. The empire was divided into eyalets provinces, governed by appointed beys or pashas, who reported back to the Divan, the imperial council, centered in Istanbul. Suleiman refined the timur system, a feudal-style land grant in exchange for military service, by reinforcing strict record-keeping, regular audits, and performance expectations. His court became a nexus of multilingual scribes, diplomats, jurists, and scholars, producing documents in Arabic, Persian, Ottoman, Turkish, and even Greek or Armenian, reflecting the diversity of the empire. At the core of this system stood the devshir-based elite, many of whom had been recruited through the Sultan's levy of Christian boys trained as janissaries or civil servants. Far from being marginalized, many of these individuals rose to the highest offices in the empire, including grand viziers and military commanders, forming a loyal and professional ruling class deeply tied to the Sultanate, rather than tribal or familial networks. Yet Suleiman's vision of order extended beyond the legal and bureaucratic. He was a deeply cultured man, personally invested in art, architecture, and literature, a poet in his own right, writing under the pen name Muhibi. Suleiman composed over 3,000 verses in Ottoman, Turkish, and Persian. His poetry, often mystical and romantic, was admired across the Islamic world and integrated into the empire's growing courtly literature. Under his rule, the Ottoman court became a center of Islamic arts, attracting Persian miniature artists, Arab theologians, Central Asian mathematicians, and Turkish architects. The most renowned of these was Sinan, a former Christian who became the chief imperial architect. Sinan's works, including the Suleimani Mosque in Istanbul, combined Byzantine, Persian, and Islamic elements into an architectural vocabulary that expressed the empire's cosmopolitan identity and spiritual grandeur. Suleiman also reformed education by expanding madrasas, emphasizing both religious and rational sciences. These institutions trained the ulama, Islamic scholars, judges, and bureaucrats who would run the empire long after his death. He supported translations of classical works into Ottoman Turkish, ensuring that his court had access to both Islamic philosophy and Greco-Roman political thought, a continuation of the cultural ambition first seen in Mehmed II's reign. Under his patronage, Istanbul matured into a global metropolis, a fusion of Islamic sanctity, Roman imperial ambition, and Persianate courtly refinement. It was a city where traders, scholars, and emissaries from Venice, Cairo, Samarkand, and Algiers mingled in bustling markets and scholarly salons by the time of his death in 1566. On campaign in Hungary, Suleiman had ruled for 46 years, the longest of any Ottoman sultan. He left behind not just an empire at its territorial height, but one with an internal cohesion, legal sophistication, and cultural identity that would persist for centuries. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman Empire had not only extended its borders, it had become a civilization. The sword had brought him power. The law secured his legacy. He was, and remains, the quintessential Ottoman ruler. Religion was the ideological and spiritual backbone of the Ottoman Empire, deeply embedded in every layer of political authority, law, daily life and cultural production. From the earliest days of Osman I, the sultans had wrapped their legitimacy in Islamic piety and prophecy, often framing their rise as part of a divine plan. But it wasn't until the 16th century, especially after Selim I's conquest of Mecca and Medina, that the Ottoman rulers could claim to be not just kings, but caliph, spiritual leaders of the entire Sunni Muslim world. This moment dramatically elevated the religious status of the Ottoman throne, intertwining Islamic authority with imperial power and giving Ottoman expansion and rule a sacred dimension. The Ottomans were Sunni Muslims of the Hanafi school of jurisprudence, one of the four major Sunni madhabs, known for its adaptability and reason-based approach. This was crucial for governing a vast, multi-ethnic empire, allowing the state to apply a flexible, yet religiously rooted, legal framework. The ulama, or body of Islamic scholars, were instrumental in the daily operation of the empire, appointed and supervised by the Sultan and his Grand Mufti Sheikh ul-Islam. These scholars acted as judges, theologians, teachers, and legal advisors across the empire. Though technically autonomous under Islamic law, the ulema were deeply integrated into the Ottoman bureaucratic machine. This gave the sultans the ability to legislate through Qanun customary law while still upholding Sharia, creating a dual legal system that reinforced the sultan's religious and political supremacy. The sultan was seen as Zil Allah, Filad, the shadow of God on earth, a caliphal figure responsible for protecting Islam, administering justice, and ensuring the material and spiritual welfare of his people. Friday sermons khutbahs were read in the name of the sultan. Coins bore his titles, and religious endowments waqfas, sponsored in his name, built mosques, hospitals, and schools. Major religious festivals, such as Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha, marked by imperial processions, public charity, and military parades, reinforcing the sultan's role as both leader of the faithful and emperor of a mighty state. Religious orthodoxy was promoted through state-controlled madrasas, which trained the next generation of scholars and judges, ensuring a consistent Sunni interpretation of law and theology. This tight integration of mosque and state helped preserve social harmony, while strengthening centralized control over religious life. But Islam was not just a political tool, it shaped the urban landscape, social ethics, and rhythms of everyday life. Cities were adorned with grand imperial mosques, neighborhood masjids, and Sufi lodges. The call to prayer echoed over cities 5 times daily. Fasting during Ramadan, almsgiving, modesty codes, and Islamic greetings were daily expressions of faith. The Ottomans cultivated an Islamic public sphere that was neither rigidly theocratic nor secular. It was woven into the moral order of society. Yet beneath this Islamic unity lay a remarkable degree of religious pluralism, especially for the Christians and Jews of the empire. This would become the hallmark of Ottoman governance, an Islamic state that could rule over a mosaic of creeds without fracturing. At the heart of the Ottoman Empire's success in ruling over a vast and religiously diverse population lay its millet system, a uniquely Ottoman innovation that allowed non-Muslim communities to practice their faiths, govern themselves in matters of religion and family law, and remain loyal subjects of the Sultan, rather than enforce a homogenizing Islamic policy or demand conversion. The Ottoman state recognized that the empire's strength came not from erasing differences, but from managing them within a structured, hierarchical framework. This system would allow Greek Orthodox Christians, Armenian Apostolics, Jews, and later other denominations to function as legally recognized, self-governing entities under the umbrella of imperial authority. The term millet originally referred to a religious nation or confessional community. Under the Ottomans, it evolved into a formalized administrative category, designating an ethno-religious group that was granted internal autonomy under the leadership of its own spiritual head. For example, the Greek Orthodox millet was headed by the Patriarch of Constantinople, who was not only a spiritual leader but also a civil administrator responsible for collecting taxes, overseeing marriage and inheritance cases, managing schools and monasteries, and ensuring the political loyalty of his flock. The Armenian Apostolic Church had a similar structure under its own patriarch, as did the Jewish millet, led by the Humbashi, or chief rabbi. Each millet operated its own religious courts, maintained schools and hospitals, and preserved its language, customs, and theological doctrines under the ultimate authority of the Sultan. In exchange for this autonomy, the millets were subject to several obligations and restrictions. Most notably, non-Muslims paid a special head tax called the jizya, a Quranic tax that granted them protection and exempted them from military service. They were also subject to certain dress codes, limits on public religious expression, and restrictions in high state office, though some exceptions were made over time, especially for Jewish and Christian financiers, physicians, and diplomats, who proved indispensable to the empire. Nevertheless, within the parameters set by the state, the millet system fostered a degree of religious freedom and institutional stability that was unmatched in contemporary Europe, where persecution of religious minorities was often brutal and systemic. Jews expelled from Spain in 1492 found refuge in Ottoman cities like Istanbul, Thessaloniki, and Izmir, where they rebuilt their communities under the protection of the Sultan. What made the millet system truly remarkable was how it integrated pluralism into the imperial bureaucracy without surrendering centralized control. The Ottomans had effectively outsourced the day-to-day governance of their non-Muslim subjects to their own leaders, who in turn ensured obedience to the Sultan and compliance with imperial taxation. This created a layered sovereignty, where the state could project its authority while avoiding the heavy-handed interference that often sparked rebellion or unrest. It also enabled communal loyalty to coexist with imperial loyalty. A Greek could be an Orthodox Christian and a faithful subject of the Muslim Sultan. A Jew could study Torah and pay jizya, while working for the Ottoman treasury or mint. Of course, the millet system was not without its hierarchical and discriminatory elements. Muslims were clearly privileged in law and society, and non-Muslims were barred from certain professions, symbolic spaces, or rights to bear arms. Still, by early modern standards, the Ottoman model of managed coexistence allowed hundreds of communities to survive, flourish, and contribute to imperial life. Markets bustled with merchants speaking Arabic, Ladino, Armenian, and Greek. Printing presses in Hebrew and Armenian published theological works, poetry, and news. Synagogues, churches, and mosques coexisted in cities from Sarajevo to Aleppo. The Ottoman Empire, though officially Islamic, functioned as a de facto multi-religious commonwealth, grounded in law, hierarchy, and practical governance. Religion in the Ottoman Empire was not confined to mosques, churches, or synagogues. It permeated every aspect of daily life, shaping how people ate, married, learned, dressed, worshipped, and even died. Ottoman society was defined by a delicate balance between collective religious identity and individual civic duty, and this interplay informed everything from family roles to market transactions, whether Muslim, Christian, or Jew. Every Ottoman subject navigated a world where faith, structured time, space, and social hierarchy. For Muslims, Islam was the state religion and defined both the public ethos and private ethics of life. Daily rituals, such as the 5 prayers, fasting during Ramadan, zakat almsgiving, and attendance at Friday prayers, were central to public life. The call to prayer, echoing across cities 5 times a day, punctuated the rhythm of commerce and governance. Markets closed during prayer times, and Ramadan brought changes to business hours, social customs, and public feasting. The Islamic calendar, not the Gregorian, dictated the year's flow for Muslims, from Mawlid prophets, birthday celebrations to Ashura processions in Shia areas like parts of Iraq and eastern Anatolia. Religious festivals were both spiritual and civic events, often attended by the Sultan or local governors, and they reinforced the ideological unity between ruler and ruled. Religious law shaped personal status, especially marriage, divorce, inheritance, and child custody. In Muslim communities, Qadis, Islamic judges, administered Sharia courts, which were open to Muslims and, in some contexts, non-Muslims who voluntarily submitted to their jurisdiction. These courts recorded everything from dowries to property transactions, serving as notarial archives and moral forums. Meanwhile, non-Muslims had access to their own religious courts through the millet system, with Christian and Jewish clerics overseeing family law within their communities. This legal pluralism ensured that daily life remained consistent with each group's traditions, while keeping society relatively harmonious. Yet, interfaith interactions were common. Shared neighborhoods, markets, baths, and even friendships fostered a surprising degree of cultural fluidity, especially in port cities like Izmir and cosmopolitan hubs like Istanbul. Education and literacy were deeply influenced by religion. Muslim boys typically attended mektebs, elementary schools attached to mosques, where they learned Quranic recitation, basic arithmetic, and morals. Those who advanced could study at madrasas, focusing on Islamic law, theology, rhetoric, logic, and sometimes astronomy and philosophy. Religious scholars formed the backbone of the ulama class, becoming judges, teachers, or state officials. Christian and Jewish children attended community-run schools in Greek, Armenian, Ladino, or Hebrew, often taught by clergy or private tutors. Education was both a spiritual formation and a social ladder, as the ability to read religious texts was equated with piety and respectability across all communities. Girls in both Muslim and non-Muslim communities were often educated at home, especially in wealthier families, where they might learn to read religious texts or manage household finances. Gender roles were also informed by religious norms, but they varied widely based on class, region, and community. In general, patriarchy was the social norm, and male authority figures, fathers, husbands, imams, priests, rabbis, wielded considerable influence. Yet women in the Ottoman Empire were far from invisible. Muslim women could inherit property, initiate divorce, and appear in court as plaintiffs or defendants. In fact, Ottoman court records reveal women who ran businesses, endowed charitable foundations, and petitioned governors. Christian and Jewish women operated under their own legal frameworks, which sometimes gave them even broader rights in inheritance or divorce. In the city's elite, women, especially in the imperial harem, exercised immense power behind the scenes, while peasant women in rural areas worked side by side with men in agriculture and crafts. Modesty and segregation norms were generally respected in public, but Ottoman society was not entirely segregated. The bustling markets, festivals, and urban squares created spaces of daily gender and religious negotiation. Religious piety was also expressed in philanthropy and public works. Wealthy Ottomans, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, commonly established wueks charitable endowments to fund mosques, schools, water fountains, caravanserais, hospitals, and soup kitchens. This created a moral economy in which religion served as a social safety net, a role comparable to modern civil society institutions. The elderly, the poor, orphans, and travelers benefited from these foundations, which were also expressions of status and virtue. Religious brotherhoods and Sufi orders, like the Mevlevis, Naqshbandis, and Bektashis, offered not only spiritual guidance, but social belonging, education, and hospitality. Their lodges hosted poetry readings, musical performances, and theological debates, creating alternative intellectual and devotional communities within the wider Islamic framework. In short, religion in the Ottoman Empire was not an abstract ideology or a private matter. It was the connective tissue of a society that managed to hold together diverse peoples across centuries by embedding faith into law, daily ritual, education, and charity. The Ottomans forged a spiritually resonant, yet remarkably tolerant civilization, one that remained surprisingly durable in a world constantly changing around it. The Ottoman Empire was not only built by the sword, it was sustained, protected, and expanded through one of the most formidable and sophisticated military systems of the early modern world. This military apparatus was not a chaotic mass of tribal warriors or temporary levies, but a highly organized, professionalized, and ideologically motivated force designed for long campaigns, rapid deployment, and statecraft. At the height of its power in the 15th–17th centuries, the Ottoman military combined feudal cavalry traditions, gunpowder technology, elite corps, and logistical infrastructure into a unified war machine that shocked both the Islamic world and Christian Europe. At its core, the Ottoman army was built on a dual foundation: the Timurid Sipari and the Janissary infantry. The Sipahis were feudal cavalrymen granted land revenues, timurs, in return for military service, recruited largely from the Muslim Turkish population. These mounted warriors formed the mobile backbone of Ottoman battlefield tactics, renowned for their speed, discipline, and devastating charges. In exchange for their land-based income, they were required to present themselves in battle with a certain number of armed retainers, creating a semi-feudal, decentralized but highly effective system of provincial defense. Their loyalty to the state was economic and hereditary, but tightly supervised by imperial inspectors and tied directly to battlefield performance. In contrast, the Janissaries Yenicheri new soldiers were a standing army composed almost entirely of Christian boys taken through the Devshirme system, a levy on non-Muslim boys from the Balkans. These boys, usually taken between the ages of 8 and 15, were converted to Islam, rigorously educated, and trained in military discipline from youth. What made the Janissaries unique was their professionalism and total allegiance to the Sultan. They lived in barracks, were paid regular salaries, forbidden to marry at least in the early centuries, and trained year-round in firearms, formation, combat, and siege warfare. Over time, they became one of the world's first standing armies, famous for their discipline, distinctive uniforms, and relentless advance under fire. The Janissaries served as palace guards, frontline shock troops, and a powerful political force within the empire. But the Ottoman military was more than just cavalry and elite infantry. It was a complex, logistical, and strategic network, incorporating a variety of specialized forces. These included Topkula artillery corps, who managed the empire's powerful siege cannons, some of which were used to breach the walls of Constantinople in 1453 to Fecula musketeers, janissaries and auxiliaries equipped with firearms, who were trained in volley fire and trench warfare, Azebs and Akinci, irregular light infantry and raiders, who were used for fast-moving campaigns, foraging and psychological warfare, naval forces, developed in the 16th century under admirals like Barbarossa, Hayreddin Pasha, who turned the Mediterranean into an Ottoman lake for decades. This military system was supported by an enormous logistical infrastructure. The Ottomans built roads, bridges, and depots throughout their empire to facilitate troop movement. Army campaigns were organized with bureaucratic precision. Food supplies, livestock, gunpowder, water, and even mobile forges followed the army in enormous baggage trains. Military engineers and surveyors mapped terrain, built fortifications, and constructed bridges under fire. The Ottoman system even included field hospitals and veterinary services, revealing an early modern awareness of sustainability in warfare. What truly distinguished the Ottomans, however, was their ability to combine warfare with statecraft. They didn't simply conquer, they administered. Victorious campaigns were quickly followed by construction projects, mosques, markets, baths, and the appointment of governors and judges, bringing new territories into the administrative fold. By mixing Shock-Handor, military dominance, with long-term infrastructural and religious integration, the Ottoman Empire ensured that conquered regions became Ottomanized not just by force, but by institutions, law, and legitimacy. The rise of the Ottoman Empire from a small Anatolian Beylik to a sprawling imperial colossus was written in the blood and dust of brilliant military campaigns, staged over nearly 3 centuries. These were not merely wars of territorial gain, they were deeply ideological and civilizational undertakings, aimed at spreading Islamic rule, asserting political legitimacy, and reordering the map of the known world. The Ottomans were not content with defensive consolidation. From the 14th century onward, they launched offensive wars on multiple fronts, against the crumbling Byzantine Empire, the Crusader states of Europe, the Mamluks of Egypt, the Safavids of Persia, and various Central European kingdoms. The first major campaign that catapulted the Ottomans to imperial stature was the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, led by the 21-year-old Sultan Mehmed II, known as Fatih the Conqueror. This was more than a military operation, it was the culmination of centuries of Islamic prophecy and ambition, with the Prophet Muhammad himself said to have foretold the city's fall. Mehmed surrounded the city with one of the most technologically advanced siege corps of the time. Using massive bronze cannons crafted by Hungarian engineer Urban, over the course of 53 days, the Ottomans bombarded the ancient walls, breached them with disciplined assaults, and ultimately overran the capital of Eastern Christendom. When Mehmed entered Hagia Sophia and ordered it converted into a mosque, it marked a new phase of Ottoman identity as inheritors of Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic authority. Constantinople became Istanbul, the empire's capital and the beating heart of a global dynasty. But Mehmed's campaigns didn't stop there. He expanded deep into the Balkans, annexed Serbia and Bosnia, and launched assaults into Wallachia, famously encountering Vlad the Impaler, whose brutal resistance became the stuff of legend and horror. His successors continued this trajectory. Sultan Selim I Javuz the Grim waged a monumental war in the early 16th century against the Safavid Empire, a Shia Persian dynasty. At the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, the Ottomans, crushed Safavid forces with superior artillery and tactical mobility. This not only checked Shia expansion into Anatolia but also marked a defining moment in the Sunni-Shia split in the Islamic world, one that still echoes geopolitically today. Selim then turned southward in one of the most geopolitically transformative campaigns of the era. In 1516 to 1517, he invaded Syria and Egypt, territories under Mamluk rule. At the battles of Marj, Dabiq, and Radaniya, the Ottoman army swept aside the Mamluks, bringing the holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem under Ottoman protection. Selim declared himself Khalifa, momentous step that gave the Ottomans religious supremacy in the Sunni world. The conquest of Egypt also granted the Ottomans control over the Red Sea trade routes and enormous wealth from Nile taxes, further integrating their empire into global commerce. The zenith of Ottoman expansion, however, came under Suleiman the Magnificent r. 1522–1566, a sultan who was both a battlefield commander and a patron of law, architecture, and arts. His campaigns transformed the empire into a pan-continental superpower. In Europe, he led multiple incursions against Hungary, Austria, and the Habsburgs. At the Battle of Mohacs in War-Lille, his forces annihilated the Hungarian army and killed King Louis II, effectively ending Hungary as an independent power. Within 3 years, Suleiman laid siege to Vienna, 1529, the symbolic heart of Christendom. Though he failed to take the city, it marked the furthest westward push of the Muslim world into Europe, a moment that terrified and galvanized the Christian powers. Simultaneously, Suleiman pursued campaigns in Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf, contesting the Safavids for control of Baghdad and Basra. His naval commanders, such as Barbarossa and Piri Reis, expanded Ottoman influence across the Mediterranean and Indian Oceans, challenging Portuguese and Spanish fleets, capturing Algiers and Tunis, and projecting Islamic power far beyond land borders. The empire's reach stretched from the gates of Vienna to the coasts of Yemen, from Transylvania to the Atlas Mountains. Yet, these vast expansions also stretched the empire's logistics and cohesion. As the Ottomans took more territory, the complexities of managing multi-ethnic, multi-faith populations under Islamic law while conducting almost constant warfare began to show. Nonetheless, for over 2 centuries, the Ottomans remained one of the most effective and feared military empires on earth, not only for their brute force, but for their ability to integrate conquest with administration, law, and infrastructure. In Part 3, we'll look into the institutional structures behind these military successes, particularly the Devshirme system, military schools, and the evolving role of gunpowder and naval warfare that kept the empire at the cutting edge of early modern combat. At the core of the Ottoman Empire's military success was not just raw manpower or battlefield courage, but a system of institutionalized military innovation and recruitment that was centuries ahead of its time. The Ottoman war machine was built upon disciplined structures, state-controlled manpower, pipelines, cutting-edge technology, and an ideological framework that fused religion with loyalty to the Sultan. This part explores the deep inner workings of the military system, particularly the Devshirme levy, the rise of gunpowder warfare, and the naval dominance that helped the empire stretch across 3 continents. One of the most remarkable and controversial aspects of the Ottoman military was the Devshirme system, a human levy that operated for nearly 300 years. Under this system, Christian boys from the empire's European provinces, particularly the Balkans and parts of Anatolia, were taken from their families, converted to Islam, and subjected to intense physical, military, and intellectual training. This was not a random or chaotic kidnapping. It was an institutionalized, bureaucratically managed practice, conducted by imperial officials every few years. Boys were selected based on physical strength, intelligence, and potential for loyalty. Many were placed with Turkish peasant families to learn the language and Muslim customs before entering elite training academies such as the Enderun Palace School in Istanbul. The Devshirme had two major outlets. The most talented and intellectually gifted boys were trained for high-level civil service, diplomacy, and administrative leadership, while the physically elite were trained as janissaries, the empire's standing infantry. This created a class of officials and soldiers who were deeply loyal to the Sultan, with no hereditary ties to tribal, ethnic, or religious factions. Ironically, these boys taken from Christian families rose to become viziers, governors, generals, and commanders, forming the empire's ruling elite. Some of the most powerful Grand Viziers in Ottoman history were Devshirme recruits, such as Sekalu Mehmed Pasha, who served 3 sultans and shaped imperial policy across decades. While modern ethics rightly question the coercion of such a system, it's crucial to understand that within the Ottoman context, this was viewed as an honor and opportunity, often resulting in social mobility far beyond what was available in the boys' native villages. Meanwhile, the Ottomans were among the earliest empires to institutionalize gunpowder warfare, transforming the very nature of military strategy and siege tactics. From the late 14th century onward, they invested heavily in artillery, muskets, and cannon engineering. During the famous siege of Constantinople in 1453, Sultan Mehmed II deployed massive bombards designed by the Hungarian engineer Urbansum, weighing over 30 tons and capable of firing stone balls over a meter in diameter. These siege weapons broke through the legendary Theodosian walls, which had withstood attackers for over a millennium. Following this success, the Ottomans standardized the use of top-Q artillery corps across all major field campaigns, building permanent foundries to cast cannons and refining battlefield deployment tactics. What made the Ottoman approach unique was how they integrated gunpowder technology into a combined arms military doctrine. Instead of relying purely on cannonades or mass infantry charges, they used musketeers, artillery, cavalry, and engineers in coordinated, multi-layered attacks. Janissaries were trained not only in firearms, but also in fortification, assault tactics, trench digging, and urban combat, making them the world's most elite siege troops in the 15th-17th centuries. Their signature battlefield formation, long row of musketeers supported by flank guards and mobile cannons, became a model later imitated by European armies. The Ottoman state also established specialized military schools and production centers. Foundries in Edirne, Istanbul, and later Damascus and Cairo produced cannons, mortar, and musket parts. Powder mills were state-regulated, ensuring consistent gunpowder quality, and a central logistics command coordinated weapon transport, repair, and ammunition stockpiling. All of this required a bureaucratic infrastructure that rivaled the civil administration. Military engineers and strategists were trained in geometry, metallurgy, and ballistics, while field officers compiled campaign reports and mapped strategic sites. In this sense, the Ottoman army was not just a fighting force, it was a mobile military-industrial complex, backed by advanced mathematics, engineering, and production capabilities. But perhaps one of the most overlooked aspects of Ottoman expansion was their naval power. Initially weak at sea, the Ottomans rose to maritime dominance in the 16th century through strategic investment and brilliant leadership. Under Suleiman the Magnificent and his Grand Admiral Barbarossa Hareddin Pasha, the Ottoman navy defeated combined European fleets, conquered North African ports, and controlled the eastern Mediterranean. The Ottomans turned the Aegean, Adriatic, and Levantine seas into Ottoman lakes, transporting troops, supplies, and administrative agents between Anatolia, the Balkans, Egypt, and the Maghreb. Naval bases in Rhodes, Crete, Algiers, and Tripoli extended imperial reach far beyond Istanbul. Naval warfare required its own institutional systems. Imperial shipyards in Galata and the Golden Horn became among the largest in the world. The Ottomans developed galley fleets, staffed by both volunteers and slaves, equipped with cannons, marines, and archers. Naval commanders were often drawn from the Devshirme class, or experienced corsairs who pledged loyalty to the Sultan. The Ottoman navy wasn't just about conquest, it ensured control of trade routes, coastal garrisons, pilgrimage, security, and regional deterrence. Battles like Preveza, 1538, where Barbarossa defeated a massive Christian fleet led by Andrea Doria, demonstrated the Ottomans' ability to dominate even coalition navies with superior maneuvering and fire discipline. Over time, however, the Ottoman military faced challenges. The Janissaries became increasingly politicized and conservative, resisting reform and refusing new training methods. Gunpowder innovation slowed as European states leapfrogged ahead in the 18th century. Yet, for nearly 300 years, the Ottoman military remained one of the most professional and feared forces on the planet, not just for its size, but for its capacity to innovate, organize, and project power across oceans and mountains alike. The Ottoman Empire was not just a military powerhouse, it was also a sophisticated administrative machine, governed through an intricate, multi-layered bureaucracy that blended Islamic principles, imperial pragmatism, and centuries of inherited administrative wisdom from the Byzantine, Persian, and Islamic worlds. At the pinnacle of this system stood the Sultan, the supreme political, military, and spiritual leader of the empire. But the daily function of governing a vast, multi-ethnic state depended not on the Sultan alone, but on a meticulously structured palace bureaucracy, a hierarchy of viziers, scribes, judges, and administrators whose effectiveness ensured the longevity of the Ottoman state. The Sultan was absolute in theory, but not in isolation. Ottoman political culture was based on a centralized yet delegated authority, where power radiated outward from the imperial capital, primarily from the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. Topkapi was not just a royal residence. It was the nucleus of imperial governance, a self-contained city of administration, ceremony, education, and intrigue. Inside its walls, decisions were made that affected millions across 3 continents. The Sultan presided over matters of state, but increasingly relied on a team of career officials who had been trained from childhood in statecraft, often Devshirme boys who had risen through the ranks. Chief among these officials was the Grand Vizier, Sadrazam, the Sultan's right-hand man and the de facto head of government. He presided over the Imperial Council Divan-i Humayun, where decisions about taxation, warfare, foreign diplomacy, internal security, and religious affairs were made. The Grand Vizier wielded the imperial seal, Emir-Shah Humayun, and had the power to issue orders, oversee provincial governors, and even command military campaigns. Other key viziers, such as the viziers of finance, Defterdar, foreign affairs, Raisul-Kutub, and military Saraska, each oversaw their domains with quasi-ministerial authority. Despite this delegation, all actions ultimately flowed back to the Sultan, whose approval, often symbolic, was still legally and religiously required. What set the Ottoman system apart from many of its contemporaries was its meritocratic character, particularly during its golden age. Bureaucrats and administrators were often not drawn from the aristocracy, which didn't formally exist in the European sense, but from slave elites. Religious scholars, or the devshem system. This helped eliminate hereditary factionalism and ensured a loyalty centered on the Sultan rather than bloodline or clan. Boys selected for administrative service were trained in the Enderun school, housed within Topkapi itself. Here they were taught not only languages and Islamic jurisprudence, but also diplomacy, literature, court etiquette, and military science. By the time they graduated, these individuals could seamlessly step into roles as ambassadors, financial officers, or even governors of key provinces. The palace also maintained a massive corps of scribes, katibs, and clerks, who managed the enormous paperwork of empire. This included records of taxation, land surveys, population counts, legal rulings, imperial decrees, firmans, and correspondence with foreign courts. These documents were preserved in vast archives, many of which survive to this day, offering modern historians unparalleled insight into daily governance. One of the key instruments of imperial control was the Tariya Sistema Cadastral Land Survey, designed to assess the empire's agricultural capacity and assign tax responsibilities. It formed the basis of the Timur system, where lands were assigned to cavalry officers, sipahis, in exchange for military service, further integrating the bureaucracy with the military. In tandem with this administrative class, the Ottomans developed an extensive legal infrastructure that balanced Islamic law Sharia with customary law Qanun. The Sultan, while bound by divine law in theory, also possessed the authority to legislate in secular matters through Canon Nem's imperial law codes. These laws regulated taxation, land ownership, market activity, crime, and public order, and were drafted by the palace's legal scholars in coordination with the Sheikh al-Islam, the empire's highest religious authority. The coexistence of Sharia and Qanun was one of the hallmarks of Ottoman governance and gave it the flexibility to rule over a multi-faith, multi-ethnic population without sacrificing religious legitimacy. Every region of the empire had its own governor, Beylar Bey, or Valier, appointed directly by the Sultan and responsible for implementing imperial orders, maintaining security, and collecting taxes. These governors oversaw district administrators, Sanjak-bi, and in turn relied on local notables and military units to enforce their rule. The administrative divisions mirrored the logic of centralization. All roads, taxes, courts, and arms ultimately answered to the Sultan in Istanbul. This highly centralized yet regionally adaptive governance model allowed the Ottomans to manage a population of over 30 million at their peak, spanning from Hungary to the Arabian Peninsula. Beneath the grandeur of the palaces and viziers, the daily operation of empire was conducted through routine, paperwork, and accountability. Inspectors Mafetti Lair were dispatched to audit tax rolls, check corruption, and report on the loyalty of provincial governors. Promotions were based on performance, not birth. Corruption was punished. At its best, the Ottoman bureaucracy was lean, meritocratic, and remarkably effective for a pre-modern state. However, the seeds of stagnation were also sown within this system. Over time, political appointments became hereditary or sold for bribes. Janissaries meddled in civil affairs. Viziers became less accountable. Yet, for over 3 centuries, this imperial machinery kept the empire not only running but thriving, managing religious pluralism, military logistics, taxation, justice, and diplomacy. with a level of professionalism few empires in history have matched. In the vast expanse of the Ottoman Empire, which spanned continents, languages, and faiths, maintaining a consistent, legitimate, and enforceable legal order was a formidable challenge. The Ottomans met this challenge with a unique fusion of Islamic legal tradition, Sharia, imperial, secular law, Qanun, and customary law, Gurf. At the heart of this dynamic legal structure stood the Qadi judge, an official who functioned not merely as an adjudicator of disputes but as a cornerstone of imperial legitimacy, moral authority, and daily governance. The Ottoman Qadi was more than a jurist, he was a scholar, administrator, public notary, ombudsman, and enforcer of both divine law and imperial will. The legal system of the Ottoman Empire rested on the dual foundation of Sharia and Qanun, forming a hybrid legal regime that allowed for remarkable flexibility. Sharia, derived from the Quran, Hadith, Prophet Muhammad's sayings, and centuries of Islamic jurisprudence, was sacred, immutable, and provided the legal framework for matters such as family law, inheritance, religious conduct, and morality. However, Sharia alone was not equipped to manage the complexities of empire. Taxation, trade, regulation, criminal penalties, urban development, or administrative orders were often outside its purview. For these issues, the sultans issued Qanun Imperio, decrees codified secular laws drafted by state officials, often in consultation with legal scholars and bureaucrats. This blend was legitimized through the position of the Sheikh al-Islam, the highest-ranking religious scholar in the empire, who issued fatwas, legal opinions, that validated the compatibility of Qanun with Islamic principles. In this way, the Sultan could exercise legislative power without undermining the sacred authority of Islam. The result was a functional, pragmatic legal system that governed Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike, while upholding the religious legitimacy of the dynasty. The Qadi was the empire's legal anchor on the ground, appointed by the central authority, specifically by the Sultan or his delegated officials. Qadis was stationed in every district and town, from the imperial capital of Istanbul to remote villages in Yemen or Bosnia. They were required to be highly educated in Islamic jurisprudence, logic, grammar, and administrative procedure, usually having studied in madrasas, Islamic schools, for over a decade. Their education was standardized across the empire to ensure uniformity of legal thought and methodology, a hallmark of Ottoman bureaucratic culture. The Qadi's primary function was to preside over court sessions and issue rulings based on Sharia and Qanun. But unlike the abstract judges of other pre-modern systems, the Qadi operated in a public and highly transparent space. The Mahkim court was held openly in mosques, public squares, or designated halls. Sessions were attended not only by the litigants, but often by community members, scribes, legal assistants, and witnesses. The presence of court scribes, who meticulously recorded every ruling in official court registers, known as sigils, meant that every legal transaction from land sales to marriages, business contracts to criminal cases, was documented in duplicate, forming one of the richest archives of legal history in the world. Qadis had jurisdiction over an expansive array of legal matters. They adjudicated civil disputes, such as property claims, debt conflicts, or commercial contracts. They oversaw family law, approving marriages, settling divorces, and determining child custody and inheritance. They regulated public morality, fining tavern owners who served alcohol in Muslim neighborhoods, or punishing slander and gossip that could undermine social cohesion. Qadis also acted as state notaries, recording sales, deeds, wills, and endowments, waqfes, which were charitable trusts that funded mosques, schools, fountains, and hospitals. Even urban planning decisions, such as approving the construction of new shops, roads, or residential homes, required Qadi validation. Crucially, the Qadi also enforced imperial law and administrative orders. When a cannoname was issued by the Sultan, it passed through the Divan Imperial Council and reached the Qadis as binding directives. They were expected to enforce these laws unless they directly contradicted Sharia, in which case the matter was referred to higher authorities, such as the Sheikh or Islam. In effect, Qadists served as the bridge between the imperial center and the local population, applying universal principles through a lens sensitive to local customs and practical realities. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Ottoman legal system was its pluralism. While Sharia was the default law for Muslims, non-Muslim communities, namely Christians and Jews, were granted autonomy to govern their personal affairs through their own religious laws and courts. These millet courts functioned under the authority of community leaders, patriarchs, rabbis, bishops, and handled cases involving marriage, divorce, inheritance, and internal disputes. However, any matter involving Muslims or intercommunal cases fell under the Qadi's court. This arrangement maintained social harmony while preserving religious freedom, a policy that contributed to the empire's stability for centuries. Qadis also had an important check on power. They could receive petitions azul from citizens against provincial governors, military officials, or tax collectors. A commoner in Aleppo, for example, could file a complaint against a corrupt janissary, and the Qadi was required to investigate. These petitions were often sent up the administrative chain, sometimes reaching the Sultan himself. This meant that even the most humble subject theoretically had access to justice, reinforcing the perception of the Sultan as a just ruler and the law as a sacred trust, not an arbitrary instrument of state control. Despite their power, Qadis were not immune to corruption. Some became entangled in local politics, accepted bribes, or showed favoritism. To counter this, the central government rotated their appointments every few years and dispatched inspectors Mufti to audit their performance. Furthermore, Qadis, who aspired to higher ranks in the legal or administrative hierarchy, knew that misconduct could end their careers. Promotion depended on reputation, performance, and connections to the elite scholarly circles in Istanbul, especially among the ulama religious scholars. In sum, the role of the Qadi in Ottoman society was multidimensional and foundational. He was the embodiment of justice, a symbol of the Sultan's authority, and the person most responsible for translating law into lived experience for millions. His courtroom was where imperial decree met local custom, where divine command met human complexity, and where the Ottoman project of justice and order, however imperfect, was brought to life. At the heart of the Ottoman Empire's administrative strength and longevity was its fiscal system, a meticulously constructed and carefully monitored apparatus that enabled the state to feed its armies, pay its officials, maintain infrastructure, and sustain imperial grandeur. But Ottoman taxation was not simply a means of collecting wealth. It was a central mechanism for organizing society, asserting control over distant provinces, rewarding loyalty, and defining the intricate relationship between ruler and subject. The fiscal policy of the empire rested upon two key pillars: land tenure, especially the timur system, and a diverse, layered system of taxation that adapted to the complex geography, economy, and social composition of the empire. The Ottoman land regime was fundamentally shaped by the Islamic understanding that all land belongs to God, and by extension, to the Sultan as God's vicegerent. As such, nearly all productive land in the empire was considered mere state-owned and could not be permanently alienated or sold. Instead, the state granted usufruct rights to use and profit from land primarily through the timar system, a uniquely Ottoman innovation that fused land management with military administration. In this system, the state assigned agricultural land to cavalry officers, known as sepahists, who were entitled to collect taxes in kind or in coin from the peasants' raya cultivating that land. In return, the Sipahi was obligated to equip himself and a number of soldiers and serve in military campaigns whenever summoned by the Sultan. The timar system was brilliantly efficient. It eliminated the need for a standing salaried military. During peacetime, spread the cost of defense across the agrarian economy, and prevented the development of a hereditary landowning aristocracy, which had destabilized many feudal European polities. Because Sipahis did not own the land, they could not pass it to their heirs, sell it, or significantly alter its use without state permission. Their position was conditional, revocable, and constantly monitored. Land grants were periodically reassessed through imperial land surveys to Reard of Deliri, which recorded everything from village populations and crop yields to local taxes and administrative boundaries. These registers, compiled by teams of state-trained scribes and inspectors, remain some of the most detailed bureaucratic documents of the pre-modern world. But the empire was too vast and complex to rely solely on the timar system. In regions where military threats were minimal or where the terrain didn't suit cavalry, the Ottomans introduced a system of tax farming iltism. Under this arrangement, the right to collect taxes in a given district or over a specific revenue stream, such as customs duties, urban market taxes, or mines, was auctioned to the highest bidder, known as a multizim. This individual paid the state a lump sum up front and then collected taxes from the population over a set term, usually 3 to 5 years. If managed fairly, this could be profitable for both the state and the tax farmer. But it also opened the door to abuse and extortion, as multizims sought to maximize profit from taxpayers already living at subsistence levels, to curb such abuses and prevent the overconcentration of wealth and power. The central government enacted strict regulations. Multizims were required to keep detailed tax registers, were subject to audits, and could be removed or punished for misconduct. Additionally, the state often split tax rights, for example, allowing one individual to collect grain taxes, another to collect animal levies, and a third to handle market tolls. This fragmentation of authority limited the chance that a single individual or family could build an independent fiscal empire within the empire. In the 17th and 18th centuries, however, this system evolved into lifelong and even hereditary tax farming rights, signaling a drift toward decentralization and elite entrenchment that would pose long-term challenges to imperial cohesion. The types of taxes levied in the Ottoman Empire were many and varied, reflecting both Islamic norms and pragmatic concerns. For Muslims, the basic tax obligations included the zakat, a religious tithe on wealth, often voluntary, and usher a 10% tax on agricultural produce. Non-Muslims, dhimmis, were subject to the jizya, a poll tax that exempted them from military service and entitled them to imperial protection. The amount was often moderate and varied depending on region and economic capacity. Additionally, all subjects regardless of religion were required to pay land taxes, market taxes, and a bewildering variety of local levies, fees for bridge maintenance, irrigation, canals, livestock, milling rights, wine production in Christian communities. and even wedding ceremonies and inheritance transfers. Taxation was not merely a fiscal tool, but a moral and political symbol. A just ruler was expected to tax lightly, fairly, and predictably. Excessive or arbitrary taxation was seen as a violation of the Sultan's divine mandate to govern with equity and adalet. Ottoman sultans issued frequent decrees reaffirming the rights of the peasantry, forbidding double taxation, and condemning corrupt officials. The circle of justice, a political philosophy inherited from Persian and Islamic thought, linked the prosperity of the peasantry to the stability of the army, the health of the treasury, and the legitimacy of the ruler. Thus, taxing too heavily could lead not only to revolt, but to cosmic disorder in the worldview of Ottoman political thought. The empire's fiscal health also depended heavily on urban centers, which were hubs of commerce, artisanship, and bureaucratic activity. Cities like Istanbul, Cairo, Aleppo, and Edirne generated immense revenue through customs duties, guild taxes, and market regulations. Guilds esnaf were required to pay corporate taxes, maintain price stability, and contribute to public works. Urban tax collection was overseen by a combination of municipal officials, cadis, and provincial governors. Ports and caravan routes, particularly those linking the empire to European trade networks, were another critical source of income, making control of cities like Alexandria, Salonika, and Izmir essential to Ottoman economic strategy. Despite its complexity, the Ottoman fiscal system functioned remarkably well for centuries. It sustained a large standing army, supported one of the world's largest bureaucracies, funded massive architectural projects, and maintained the loyalty of local elites across a diverse and sprawling empire. Yet, by the 18th century, pressures began to mount. Military defeats drained the treasury. Inflation driven by New World silver destabilized the economy, and corrupt tax farming practices weakened the social fabric. The state responded with reforms centralizing finance under new ministries, auditing tax collectors, and modernizing currency. But these measures were often piecemeal and too late to reverse long-term trends. Still, the Ottoman system of land and taxation based on the fusion of Islamic principles, military necessity, and administrative rationality remains one of the most sophisticated fiscal structures in world history, notable for its adaptability, its longevity, and its profound influence on the populations it governed. The Ottoman Empire did not rise from a whisper of nomads into a superpower of global consequence without the disciplined application of overwhelming force. At the heart of this ascension was a military system that evolved over centuries from tribal, horse-mounted warfare to a professionalized, multi-branch military apparatus that wielded cutting-edge gunpowder weapons, coordinated logistical systems, and a sophisticated command structure. The success of Ottoman arms was not merely due to brute strength, it was also a product of innovation, institutionalization, ideological cohesion, and the empire's ability to adapt to changing forms of warfare across 3 continents. In its earliest phase, during the 13th and early 14th centuries, the Ottomans emerged as one of many Turkic Ghazi emirates operating along the volatile Byzantine frontier in Anatolia. These early Ottomans practiced a form of nomadic light cavalry warfare, well suited to the rugged Anatolian terrain and the fragmented political environment of post-Seljuk Anatolia. The earliest Ottoman soldiers were tribal warriors bound by loyalty to the chieftain, in this case Osman, and imbued with a militant religious zeal rooted in Gaza. The Islamic concept of holy struggle against non-Muslims. This ideological framing was crucial. It fused spiritual reward with temporal conquest. turning raids into acts of piety and aligning military expansion with divine will. As the Ottomans grew in power and territory, they began to incorporate not only Muslim warriors but also Christian auxiliaries, Balkan militias, and vassal troops into their army. By the reign of Orhan R. 1326 to 1362, the Ottomans began transitioning from loosely organized tribal forces to standing salaried troops under central command. This shift culminated in the creation of one of the most famous and feared military institutions of the pre-modern world, the Janissary Corps. The Janissaries, were founded in the mid-14th century, originally composed of Christian boys recruited through the Devshirme system, a levy on the empire's Christian population in the Balkans. These boys, taken from their families as young as age 8 or 9, were converted to Islam, rigorously educated, trained in arms, and instilled with unbreakable loyalty to the Sultan. The Devshirme was both a tool of centralization and an act of created an elite military and administrative class with no familial or tribal ties to rival power centers. Janissaries were forbidden from marrying or engaging in commerce, wore distinctive uniforms, and lived communally under strict discipline. Their training emphasized archery, swordsmanship, close order drills, and later, muskets and cannons, making them one of the first standing armies in Europe to fully embrace gunpowder warfare. The rise of the Janissaries marked a revolution in Ottoman military doctrine. No longer would the empire rely solely on mounted raiders and feudal levies. Instead, it would field a permanent, professional infantry, supported by the treasury, educated in state ideology, and deployed as the Sultan's personal guard. The Janissaries became the backbone of the Ottoman conquests in Europe. They were present at the sieges of Constantinople, 1453, Belgrade 1521, and Vienna 1529. Their reputation for discipline and shock combat was so formidable that European powers studied their tactics and adopted similar corps, such as the Russian Streltsy or the French musketeers. However, the Janissaries were not the only arm of the military. The Timuriot Sipahis, drawn from the land-grant cavalry class, discussed in Episode 6, formed the empire's feudal horsemen light and medium cavalry equipped with lances, sabers, and bows. These Sipahis were crucial in battles requiring mobility, flanking, and the pursuit of routed enemies. While the Janissaries held the line, Sipahis would sweep the battlefield, exploiting weaknesses and enveloping enemy formations. Their military service was directly tied to their land grants, and they operated under a chain of command extending from provincial beys to the Sultan himself. The Ottomans also maintained a variety of irregular troops, known as azabs, and Delhi units. These soldiers were often volunteers, mercenaries, or adventurers, and were used for scouting, skirmishing, raiding, and terror tactics. The Akankars in particular became infamous in Europe for their lightning-fast raids into enemy territory, leaving devastation in their wake. Though poorly armored and loosely trained, these irregulars played a strategic role in softening enemy resistance, destroying crops and infrastructure, and spreading psychological fear long before formal campaigns began. One of the most critical innovations the Ottomans embraced was gunpowder technology. Unlike many other Islamic powers who hesitated to adopt firearms for fear of undermining the traditional warrior ethos, the Ottomans fully embraced cannons, matchlocks, and mortar. The use of massive siege artillery, such as the colossal bombards used during the conquest of Constantinople, demonstrated the empire's early recognition of gunpowder as a decisive instrument of empire building. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, Ottoman gunners Topkula were among the finest in the world, producing cannon on site using mobile foundries, establishing elite artillery guilds, and integrating firepower into every aspect of battlefield strategy. Yet the Ottomans understood that victory was not won through combat alone. Their military machine was supported by logistics, engineering, and infrastructure. Campaigns were planned months in advance, with massive convoys of food, fodder, and ammunition moving from depots to front lines. Military roads were repaired or built anew, pontoon bridges constructed, and siege trains hauled across mountains and rivers. Engineers Mimila and Meta Takemik constructed fortifications, siege platforms, and battering equipment. The army even had specialized musical corps, Meta, whose martial rhythms coordinated troop movements and instilled morale during battle. In sum, the foundations of Ottoman military power rested on three interlocking elements: a professional corps of infantry janissaries, a flexible and regionally integrated cavalry sipahes, and overwhelming firepower delivered by artillery and engineering. These forces were bound together by the empire's bureaucratic and ideological infrastructure, a system in which military service was rewarded with land or salary, where loyalty to the Sultan superseded all tribal or ethnic identity, and where religious legitimacy and state power were fused into a single imperial project. This military machine was not only the hammer of conquest, it was the shield of stability, projecting power from the Danube to the Tigris, from the Caucasus to the Red Sea. For centuries, it allowed the Ottoman Empire to dominate rivals, expand its borders, and retain control over diverse and distant populations. But as we shall see in the next parts, this machine would eventually face new challenges, both internal and external, that would test its resilience in the age of changing warfare. The Janissaries, perhaps the most iconic military formation of the Ottoman Empire, stood not only as the physical backbone of the Sultan's might, but as a living embodiment of the Ottoman state's ideological, social, and bureaucratic power. Their history charts a fascinating evolution from elite, highly trained shock troops to an entrenched, politically powerful class whose resistance to reform would ultimately undermine the very state they once upheld. Understanding the Janissaries in their full complexity means unpacking their origins, their military excellence, their social role, their political transformation, and finally, their decay, a cycle of institutional brilliance and eventual ossification that mirrored broader imperial trends. The Janissary Corps, Yenissary Okagi, literally new corps, began as a radical experiment in centralized military control and social engineering. As described in Part 1, the corps was initially formed through the Devsham system, a controversial but ingenious innovation that allowed the Ottoman state to tap into the Christian population of the Balkans for its most loyal and skilled personnel. Every few years, imperial officials would tour Christian villages and select the most promising boys, typically aged 8 to 14, based on strict physical, intellectual, and moral criteria. These children were taken to Istanbul, forcibly converted to Islam, and placed into one of two paths. The most intelligent and talented were sent to the palace school Enderun, groomed for high administrative office. The rest were placed in the Asimio clan novice boys' corps, where they would be trained for military service. This training regimen was intense, ascetic, and comprehensive. The Asimi Oaklands were taught not only military drills, but also Turkish, Arabic, Islamic law, and Ottoman court etiquette. They were instilled with a fierce sense of loyalty to the Sultan, and deliberately severed from their biological families and prior communities. Unlike feudal levies or mercenaries, the Janissaries had no ties to land, lineage, or tribe, only to the Sultan and the state. This erasure of prior identity and the crafting of a new, state-centric persona was what made the Janissaries unique in world history. A standing, salaried infantry corps of former Christian children turned into the empire's most trusted Muslim warriors. By the reign of Sultan Murad I (1362 to 1389), the Janissaries had already distinguished themselves on the battlefield, forming the professional corps around which the Ottoman military could coalesce. In battle, they fought in tightly packed formations, initially using bows and swords, but by the 15th century becoming among the earliest military units in the world to standardize the use of firearms. Janissaries carried matchlock muskets, wore distinctive uniforms with high felt hats called birk, and were supported by dedicated logistics, armorers, and artillery crews. Their drill, discipline, and cohesion made them a match for the armored knights of Europe, and they were instrumental in nearly every major Ottoman conquest from the Balkans to Mesopotamia. The conquest of Constantinople in 1453 stands as the Janissaries' most legendary achievement. As the vanguard of the assault, they breached the Theodosian walls, fought in savage close quarters, and ultimately entered Hagia Sophia alongside Sultan Mehmed II. From this point onward, the Janissaries acquired an aura of invincibility and sacred duty. They were seen not merely as soldiers, but as the embodiment of the Sultan's justice, mercy, and vengeance. They were housed in the capital in their own district Yeni, Erik, thus received stipends from the treasury, and enjoyed a wide range of privileges, access to elite training, political patronage, and even participation in state ceremonies. For centuries, their loyalty to the Sultan was considered absolute. However, beginning in the late 16th century, the character of the cause began to shift in ways that would prove dangerous. Several factors drove this transformation. First, the Devshirme system began to decline as fewer recruits were drawn from Christian villages, due in part to population depletion and Christian resistance. Simultaneously, the Ottoman state, under financial strain and military pressure, began relaxing its recruitment policies, allowing Muslim-born Anatolians to enter the Janissary ranks. This broke the original design of the cause, which had depended on a deliberate separation from familial and social networks. Janissaries began to marry, engage in commerce, and pass down their positions to sons and nephews, turning what had once been a celibate warrior brotherhood into a hereditary caste. The cause expanded uncontrollably, with thousands of individuals seeking entry not to serve in battle, but to access the privileges and salaries attached to the uniform. By the 17th century, Janissaries had become a powerful political lobby, capable of influencing court politics, deposing sultans, and blocking reforms they perceived as threats to their interests. They staged numerous mutinies called Isyanlark, assassinated grand viziers, and even dictated terms to the palace. Ironically, the very loyalty that had once made them invaluable now made them dangerous. They saw themselves not as servants of the Sultan but as stakeholders in state power. This institutional rot also had grave military consequences. Janissaries increasingly resisted field duty, preferring to remain in urban garrisons. They clung to outdated weapons and tactics, even as European armies modernized rapidly with linear formations, bayonets, and volley fire. When Ottoman commanders attempted to raise new corps or introduce European-style reforms, the Janissaries often rebelled violently. One such episode occurred in 1622, when Sultan Osman II frustrated with Janissary insubordination, attempted to replace them with an ethnically Turkish army. The Janissaries responded by storming the palace, imprisoning the Sultan, and strangling him to death, a stunning event that underscored their stranglehold over the Ottoman political system. By the 18th century, the Janissary corps had become a paradox, simultaneously revered as a symbol of Ottoman greatness and reviled as a barrier to military reform and state survival. Their numbers had swelled into the tens of thousands, many of them idle, corrupt, and politically connected. They meddled in provincial affairs, collected bribes, and increasingly aligned with urban guilds and conservative religious factions, creating a broad reactionary front against modernization. This long arc of glory, corruption, and resistance to change would finally come to a dramatic end in 1826. During the reign of Mahmud II, after years of failed attempts to reform the cause, Mahmud orchestrated a daring maneuver known as the Auspicious Incident Vokai Hayrai. Having secretly trained a new army under European models, he baited the Janissaries into open revolt, then used artillery and loyal troops to crush the uprising, destroying their barracks and disbanding the corps entirely. Thousands of Janissaries were killed, imprisoned, or exiled. It was a violent but necessary purge that opened the door for a modern, professional Ottoman military, but it also marked the symbolic end of a foundational institution that had defined the empire for nearly 500 years. Thus, the Janissaries, once the most advanced and disciplined fighting force of the early modern world, serve as both a testament to Ottoman ingenuity and a cautionary tale about institutional rigidity. Their rise and fall illuminates the challenges of maintaining elite forces over centuries, the tension between tradition and innovation, the seduction of privilege, and the slow corrosion of ideals once noble. They remain one of the most fascinating and complex military phenomena in world history. The Ottoman Empire's embrace of gunpowder technology was neither passive nor belated. It was active, aggressive, and visionary. While many powers of the Islamic world hesitated to fully adopt firearms, the Ottomans, beginning in the 15th century, recognized that the strategic utility of gunpowder could be decisive in both siege warfare and open field battles. As a result, the empire became one of the earliest and most effective gunpowder empires in history. What made this adoption revolutionary was not just the technology itself, but the way in which the Ottomans integrated gunpowder weapons into a coherent combined arms doctrine, supported by specialized troops, logistical networks, and industrial-scale production facilities. The siege of Constantinople in 1453 is perhaps the most iconic example of early Ottoman artillery warfare. Under the command of Sultan Mehmed II, the Ottomans deployed some of the largest siege cannons ever constructed at the time, including the legendary Basilica Bombard, designed by Hungarian engineer Urban. This massive cannon, capable of firing 600 to 800-pound stone balls, represented a leap in siege technology. For 53 days, Ottoman gunners relentlessly battered the Theodosian walls, which had withstood centuries of invasion. The psychological and physical effect of this sustained bombardment was overwhelming, contributing directly to the fall of Byzantium and earning Mehmed the title the Conqueror. This event served as a stark demonstration to the rest of Europe. Gunpowder artillery had changed the rules of war forever, but the Ottomans were not content with brute force. They developed a sophisticated artillery corps, the Topçu, Okagi, that became a formal and respected part of the military hierarchy. These gunners were trained in ballistics, metallurgy, and engineering, and maintained mobile cannon foundries that could cast artillery on campaign. Ottoman artillery was classified into various types based on function. great bombards for sieges, medium cannons for field engagements, and smaller, lighter pieces for maneuverability. The Empire even pioneered the use of grenade-launching troops, Humber mortar units, and rocket-propelled incendiaries, showing a remarkable adaptability in early modern weapons science on the battlefield. The Ottomans developed tactical formations that capitalized on the strengths of both traditional and modern weaponry. A typical Ottoman army would center around the Janissary corps, now equipped with matchlock muskets by the late 15th century. These musketeers would deploy behind portable wooden barriers known as saipa, from which they could fire volleys at approaching enemies. The artillery line, placed either behind or interspersed among the Janissaries, would soften enemy formations before they closed. Meanwhile, the Sipahi cavalry, drawn from the provincial landholding class, would operate on the flanks, executing envelopments, charges, and pursuit operations. This interplay between firepower and mobility made the Ottoman army unusually flexible compared to its contemporaries. A brilliant demonstration of this tactical sophistication came during the Battle of Mohacs, Ewu Arlil, against the Kingdom of Hungary. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent arranged his army in a deliberate ambush, infantry and artillery in the center, with the Sipahis concealed in the wings. As the Hungarian heavy cavalry charged toward the center, they were met with devastating musket and cannon fire, slowing their momentum. At the critical moment, Ottoman cavalry swept in from both flanks, surrounding and annihilating the enemy. The entire battle lasted under 2 hours, but shattered the Hungarian monarchy and opened Central Europe to Ottoman influence. Mohacs became a textbook example of gunpowder-driven, asymmetric warfare, where disciplined infantry and firepower trumped feudal cavalry charges. Beyond tactics, the Ottomans also invested heavily in military infrastructure. Strategic fortresses such as Ekri, Belgrade, and Buda were reinforced with bastions designed to withstand cannon fire. The Ottomans developed elaborate siege protocols, including the use of sapping, mining, countermining trenches, and forward batteries. Engineers were critical. Not only did they operate siege machinery, but they were also responsible for building pontoon bridges, redirecting rivers, draining swamps, and repairing roads, allowing entire armies to cross vast distances with relative speed. This logistical capacity gave the Ottomans strategic depth unmatched by many contemporaries. Despite all this, the 17th and 18th centuries brought significant challenges. As Western European powers entered the military revolution, they developed more efficient firing drills, lighter field artillery, mobile supply chains, and formal officer academies. Ottoman tactics, once superior, began to lag behind. A key problem was institutional resistance to innovation, particularly from the Janissaries and military guilds who viewed modernization as a threat to their privileges. While some sultans, such as Selim III, attempted reforms, like the Nizam-I-Sedid New Order Army, these efforts were often crushed by conservative backlash or simply lacked adequate funding and support. Moreover, the industrialization of war in Europe, mass production of firearms, standardized uniforms, mass conscription, created a widening technological gap. Ottoman artillery, while still formidable, fell behind in accuracy and reload speed. Muskets used by Janissaries were heavier and slower than the flintlock rifles of their European rivals. Military defeats at Vienna 1683, Zenta 1697, and Lepanto 1571 revealed the limits of even the most elite corps when confronted with enemies who had adapted faster to the age of gunpowder and scientific warfare. Nevertheless, The legacy of Ottoman battlefield doctrine is undeniable. The empire was one of the few in history to build a multi-ethnic, multi-faith, multi-weapon army that could sustain campaigns from the Habsburg borderlands to the Persian Gulf. The coordination between cavalry, infantry, artillery, and logistics in the 15th and 16th centuries was centuries ahead of many contemporary rivals, and even as the empire struggled to maintain its edge in the face of modernity, the image of Ottoman soldiers, janissaries with muskets, gunners beside massive bronze cannons, cavalry sweeping across the plains remained, burned into the imagination of both Europe and the Islamic world. While the Ottoman Empire is often remembered for its vast land armies and sweeping conquests across the Balkans and the Middle East, it was also a maritime power of formidable strength and strategic vision. Its rise as a naval force did not occur overnight. It evolved from modest coastal operations to an empire-spanning fleet that challenged European powers in the Aegean, Adriatic, and Mediterranean seas. The Ottoman navy not only facilitated the transportation of troops and resources, but also projected imperial power across maritime frontiers, enabling trade, diplomacy, and war. The birth of Ottoman sea power, though less glorified than the rise of its janissaries or cavalry, was no less transformative. It began humbly in the early 14th century, before growing into one of the most powerful navies in the world by the 16th. The Gallipoli Peninsula, located strategically at the entrance to the Dardanelles, was the Ottoman Empire's first major naval base. Seized in 1354 after an earthquake weakened Byzantine defences, Gallipoli offered the Ottomans their first crucial foothold in Europe and a key position from which to develop a maritime strategy. Initially, the Ottomans had no significant naval tradition. They were a land-based power descended from the Central Asian steppe, but geography demanded adaptation. The control of the Bosporus, the Dardanelles, the Aegean Islands, and the Black Sea would all become vital to the empire's expansion. From Gallipoli, the Ottomans began constructing a modest fleet of galleys, manned by Christian converts and coastal recruits from newly acquired territories in Anatolia and the Balkans. The early Ottoman navy was small, but highly mobile, and served primarily in support of land operations, transporting troops, raiding enemy ports, and controlling key straits. A major turning point came during the reign of Bayezid I. Era 1389 a 1402, who began to see the strategic value of controlling Aegean coastal cities and islands, many of which were under Byzantine, Venetian, or Genoese influence. However, the Ottoman naval program suffered a severe setback with the Battle of Ancora in 1402, where Bayezid was defeated and captured by Tamerlane. The resulting Ottoman interregnum temporarily halted naval development, but by the mid-15th century, under the dynamic leadership of Sultan Mehmed II, the Ottomans re-emerged with a clear vision to dominate both land and sea in pursuit of imperial supremacy. The most iconic demonstration of this maritime ambition came during the Siege of Constantinople in 1453, while the Janissaries and artillery corps besieged the walls from the land. Mehmed II knew that naval supremacy was essential to prevent reinforcements from reaching the Byzantines. The Byzantine capital was protected not only by the triple land walls but also by the Golden Horn, a natural harbour blocked by a massive chain. To bypass this obstacle, Mehmed II ordered his engineers to drag dozens of ships overland across greased wooden planks from the Bosporus, around Galata, and into the Golden Horn. This astonishing maneuver shocked the defenders and allowed the Ottomans to bombard the city from both sides. The successful coordination between land and naval forces marked a watershed moment in Ottoman military history. It showcased the empire's capacity for naval innovation, strategic planning, and technological adaptation. Following the conquest of Constantinople, Mehmed II began to institutionalize and expand the Ottoman navy. The imperial arsenal, Tersanay Maya, was established in Istanbul's Golden Horn, and quickly became one of the largest and most sophisticated shipyards in the world. Capable of producing dozens of ships annually, their hundreds of skilled craftsmen, carpenters, rope makers, sail weavers, and blacksmiths built everything from light galleys to large galleasses. The Ottomans also formalized the hierarchy of naval command, introducing the title of Kaptan Pasha, or Grand Admiral of the Fleet. Under this office, the Navy began conducting regular patrols, anti-piracy operations, and coastal defense missions. The integration of naval affairs into the Ottoman state apparatus gave the fleet permanence and structure as the 15th century gave way to the 16th. The Ottoman navy expanded its range and mission. It now sought not only to defend coastal provinces and support army campaigns, but to actively project Ottoman power across the entire eastern Mediterranean, and eventually beyond. This required not just galleys and sailors, but seasoned naval commanders, many of whom came from the ranks of corsairs, former pirates, and coastal warlords who pledged loyalty to the Sultan. Among them would rise the most famous admiral in Ottoman and Mediterranean history, Hayreddin Barbarossa, who would transform the naval balance of power in the Mediterranean. But his story and the golden age of Ottoman sea power would unfold in the next chapter. The 16th century marked the zenith of Ottoman naval supremacy, a period during which the empire transformed from a regional sea power into a dominant maritime empire capable of contending with the greatest naval forces in the world. This golden age was defined not only by the expansion of the fleet and improvements in shipbuilding, but also by the rise of a generation of legendary admirals and corsairs, chief among them the formidable Hayreddin Barbarossa. Under his leadership and the patronage of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottomans waged war, negotiated peace, and commanded vast stretches of the Mediterranean, Aegean, Adriatic, and Red Seas, redefining the geopolitical landscape of maritime Europe and North Africa. Hayreddin Barbarossa, born Kiza race, later given the honorific Hayreddin, meaning goodness of the faith, by the Sultan, was not born into the imperial navy but rose through the ranks as a corsair operating along the North African coast. Along with his brother Oruk Reis, he built a feared naval force based in Algiers, preying on Christian ships and coastal settlements in the western Mediterranean. Oruk was killed in battle against Spanish forces, after which Kiza took up his brother's mantle, consolidating power along the Maghreb coast. Recognizing his growing influence and strategic value, Sultan Selim I formally incorporated Barbarossa's domain into the Ottoman Empire and appointed him Beylerbeye Governor-General of Algiers, thus merging the ferocity of piracy with the discipline of imperial service. With imperial backing, Barbarossa's power grew exponentially. In 1534, he captured Tunis, forcing the Hafsid ruler into exile. Though the city would later be retaken by Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, Barbarossa had already solidified Ottoman influence over the central Mediterranean. In 1538, now serving as Kaptan Pasha, Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, he led a combined fleet of 122 galleys and galleasses into the Battle of Preveza, a seminal naval engagement against the so-called Holy League, a Christian alliance organized by the Pope and led by the famed Genoese Admiral Andrea Doria. The Battle of Preveza was a tactical masterpiece. Fighting near the coast of northwestern Greece, Barbarossa exploited superior seamanship shallow water tactics, and the agility of Ottoman galleys. Despite being outnumbered, he encircled the Holy League fleet and dealt them a crushing defeat. The victory secured Ottoman dominance over the eastern Mediterranean for decades. Not only did it demonstrate the effectiveness of Ottoman naval doctrine, but it also humiliated Christian Europe and revealed the inadequacy of its fragmented maritime alliances in the face of unified imperial command. For the rest of the 16th century, no Christian fleet dared challenge the Ottomans in open battle. Under Barbarossa and his successors such as Turgut Reis, Piali Pasha, and Uluk Ali Raista, Ottoman navy reached new heights. These admirals were more than warriors. They were statesmen, diplomats, and administratorfo, governed port cities, oversaw maritime trade, and brokered treaties. Their campaigns stretched from the Strait of Gibraltar to the Persian Gulf, disrupting Iberian trade routes, challenging Phoenician sea power, and clashing with the Knights of St. John in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. The Ottomans confronted Portuguese expansion, attempting to defend Muslim trade networks and holy cities, while their operations in the Indian Ocean met with limited success due to logistical challenges and inferior ship design for oceanic navigation. Their presence signaled the global ambitions of Ottoman naval strategy. The imperial arsenal in Istanbul, Tersanay Maya, grew to become the largest shipyard in the Mediterranean, employing thousands of craftsmen and producing fleets at an industrial pace. Galleys and galleasses were built en masse, supplied with artillery cast in state-run foundries and crewed by enslaved oarsmen, paid seamen, and conscripted sailors from throughout the empire. Naval logistics were meticulously organized. Ottoman fleets carried fresh water in amphorae, ship biscuits for sustenance, and even field blacksmiths and surgeons for prolonged missions. Each fleet had its court clerks, paymasters, religious chaplains, and quartermasters, demonstrating a degree of naval bureaucracy that rivaled or exceeded its European counterparts. Ottoman naval power was also deeply tied to Islamic ideology and imperial prestige. Captains raised the green flag of Islam, and pre-battle sermons emphasized the religious dimensions of war against Christian foes. However, this ideological posture never prevented diplomatic pragmatism. In a striking example, the Ottomans formed an alliance with France, a Catholic nation, under Francis I, against the Habsburgs. This Franco-Ottoman naval cooperation, particularly in the 1540s, shocked Christian Europe and demonstrated the flexible, strategic diplomacy of the Porte. French ships were even permitted to dock in Ottoman harbors, and joint operations were conducted in the western Mediterranean, including raids on Spanish and Italian territories. By the mid-16th century, the Ottoman navy had become more than a fighting force. It was a tool of projection, a mechanism of empire, and a symbol of global ambition. It guarded sea routes from Alexandria to Venice, escorted the imperial Hajj fleet to Mecca, protected Muslim pilgrims, and maintained a delicate balance between war and commerce in seas shared by Venetians, Genoese, Spaniards, and North African powers. The Mediterranean, once a Christian lake, had become a Muslim-controlled maritime corridor, dominated by the iron discipline of Ottoman admirals and the relentless thunder of their oars. The 16th century's dazzling maritime dominance under Barbarossa and his successors marked the high tide of Ottoman naval supremacy. But no empire escapes the pull of time. By the latter half of the century, the Ottoman fleet would meet its most formidable challenge at the Battle of Lepanto 1571, a clash that, while not immediately fatal, revealed the growing cracks in the empire's maritime power. The sea, once a realm of conquest and glory for the Sublime Porte, became a contested and costly frontier, as European naval powers modernized, unified, and began to reclaim lost ground. Lepanto was more than a battle, it was the symbolic turning point in the Mediterranean, a clash of civilizations, ideologies, and naval technologies that set the stage for centuries of shifting maritime balance. The road to Lepanto began with the Ottoman conquest of Cyprus, a strategic island controlled by Venice that served as a vital base for Christian naval power and commerce. In 1570, under Sultan Selim II, the Ottoman fleet launched a full-scale assault, capturing Nicosia and then besieging Famagusta. Despite fierce resistance, the Ottomans prevailed, completing the conquest in 1571. This expansion, though successful, alarmed Christian Europe. Pope Pius V responded by forging the Holy League, an unprecedented alliance of Catholic states including Spain, Venice, the Papal States, Genoa, and several smaller Italian powers. The command of this alliance fell to Don John of Austria, the half-brother of King Philip II of Spain. A massive Christian fleet was assembled, more than 200 galleasses, prepared to confront the Ottomans in the Gulf of Patras, near western Greece. On October 7, 1571, the Battle of Lepanto erupted. The Christian fleet and the Ottoman navy, led by Mu'tasim Ali Pasha, clashed in one of the largest naval battles since antiquity. The fleets were comparable in size, each with over 200 ships, and the battle was fought in traditional galley warfare style. Ships rowing into close range, grappling, and boarding with hand-to-hand combat. However, the Christian fleet had several technological and tactical advantages. More heavily armed galleasses, larger ships, bristling with cannons, tighter discipline, and the element of coordination under unified command. The Ottomans, while brave and seasoned, were outgunned and outmaneuvered. Mu'tasim Ali Pasha was killed in the fray, and much of the Ottoman fleet was either captured or destroyed. Around 30,000 Ottoman sailors and soldiers were killed or enslaved, a devastating loss. Lepanto was the first major defeat of the Ottoman navy in over a century and sent shockwaves across Europe. It was hailed as a turning point in the long struggle between Islam and Christianity, celebrated in poems, paintings, and sermons as a divine triumph. However, the impact of Lepanto was more psychological than strategic. Within a year, the Ottomans had rebuilt their fleet, launching over 150 new galleys from the imperial arsenal in Istanbul. The sheer speed of this reconstruction astonished European observers and testified to the industrial might of the empire. Despite the loss, the Ottomans retained control over Cyprus, and their dominance in the eastern Mediterranean remained largely intact for decades. Still, Lepanto exposed deep structural weaknesses. The age of the galley, the fast, narrow warship powered by oars, was giving way to the age of the galleon, with large, sail-powered vessels armed with heavy broadsides. European navies, especially Spain and later England and the Dutch, were adapting to open ocean warfare, oceanic trade, and ship designs that emphasized artillery over boarding tactics. The Ottomans, bound by the geography of the Mediterranean and institutional inertia, were slower to adapt. The navy remained heavily reliant on galleys long after they had become obsolete in major naval warfare. This technological conservatism, coupled with a lack of a true merchant marine or global naval strategy, began to limit Ottoman maritime relevance. Over the 17th and 18th centuries, the Ottoman navy shifted increasingly to a defensive role, protecting coastal cities, escorting convoys, and combating piracy. While capable of localized victories, it struggled to project force beyond the eastern Mediterranean, The rise of European colonial empires, with their massive sail-powered fleets and transoceanic ambitions, relegated the Ottomans to the periphery of naval history. Naval reform was attempted intermittently, especially under sultans like Selim III and Mahmud II, but these efforts were often stymied by corruption, internal politics, and the dominance of conservative factions within the palace and the Janissary corps. By the 19th century, the once proud Ottoman fleet was no longer a symbol of fear but of decline. The humiliating loss of the fleet at the Battle of Navarino, 1827, where Allied British, French, and Russian navies annihilated the Ottoman-Egyptian fleet during the Greek War of Independence, marked another nadir. The empire increasingly turned to European advisors, shipbuilders, and technology to modernize its navy, often with mixed success. The Ottoman navy never again achieved the level of power and prestige it held during the age of Barbarossa, and yet, the legacy of the Ottoman navy endures. For centuries, it shaped the politics, economies, and cultures of the Mediterranean. It fostered maritime architecture, generated a rich tradition of naval cartography, and gave rise to legends that still echo in Turkish, Arab, and European folklore. Its admirals were not just warriors, but state builders, architects of empire, and guardians of Islam's maritime frontiers. The rise and fall of Ottoman sea power is not just the story of ships and battles. It is the story of how an inland empire learned to command the waves, for a time bending the seas of the world to its will. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the once mighty Ottoman Empire, which had dazzled the world through the brilliance of its military conquests and administrative efficiency, began to enter a complex period often characterized by historians as an era of stagnation. However, this label can be misleading, as it masks the deep structural challenges and profound internal transformations that tested the very resilience of the empire. The empire's vastness stretching across 3 continents and its multicultural, multi-religious composition demanded an extraordinary level of political dexterity and institutional adaptability. Unfortunately, during this era, a combination of military, economic, and administrative stresses revealed fissures in the Ottoman system that, if left unchecked, would threaten its continued survival. One of the most visible signs of this period was the relative decline of the elite military corps, particularly the Janissaries. Once an elite, highly disciplined, and innovative fighting force, the Janissaries had by the 17th century evolved into a powerful political faction often resistant to change. Their numbers swelled beyond the capacity of the empire's economy to sustain, and their effectiveness on the battlefield diminished as they engaged in corrupt practices and politicized their role. Their entrenched power also made it difficult for the sultans to implement necessary military reforms, effectively stalling modernization efforts in the army. Simultaneously, provincial governors, known as beys and pashas, increasingly acted as semi-autonomous rulers, extracting heavy taxes and amassing personal power at the expense of central authority, which weakened the empire's cohesion. Economically, the empire faced challenges on multiple fronts. The discovery of the New World and new sea routes to Asia by European powers diminished the Ottoman control of traditional overland trade routes. The empire's wealth, once buoyed by the Silk Road and Mediterranean commerce, now faced competition from Atlantic-centered European trade networks. This shift reduced customs revenues and disrupted internal markets. Inflation caused by the influx of New World silver, combined with poor fiscal management and occasional famines, strained the imperial treasury. Attempts to increase taxation often provoked unrest in the provinces, contributing to a cycle of rebellion and repression that further sapped imperial resources. Moreover, the Ottoman administrative system, centered around the classical land grant and tax farming system, showed signs of fatigue. Timmerholders, who provided cavalry troops in exchange for land revenues, increasingly sold their rights or neglected military service, contributing to the decline in cavalry effectiveness. The complex bureaucracy, while still formidable, became increasingly burdened by nepotism and patronage networks, leading to inefficiency. The ulama, Islamic scholars and jurists, retained significant influence over legal and educational institutions, but were often conservative forces opposing reforms. At the same time, the empire struggled to accommodate the demands of its diverse religious and ethnic communities, from Greeks and Armenians to Arabs and Kurds. As nationalist ideas began to penetrate, the external political environment also grew more hostile. The Ottoman Empire faced sustained military pressure from rising European powers, notably the Habsburgs in Central Europe and the Russian Empire to the north and east. The long, drawn-out wars with the Habsburgs drained Ottoman resources and resulted in the loss of key territories in Hungary and the Balkans. The Treaty of Karlowitz, 1699, following Ottoman defeat, marked a significant shift. The empire ceded large swaths of European land, signaling a clear end to its expansionist phase and the beginning of defensive retrenchment. Despite these difficulties, the empire was not merely passive. Sultans, viziers, and intellectuals were aware of the challenges and debated how best to respond. The period saw the emergence of early reformist ideas, influenced in part by Ottoman contact with European states through trade, diplomacy, and warfare. These ideas often collided with traditional power centers and the inertia of entrenched institutions. As a result, the 17th century was characterized by a tension between conservatism and innovation, with occasional attempts at military modernizations as the establishment of artillery corps and naval reforms interspersed with conservative backlashes in some. This era was not simply one of decline, but one of complex transformation and resilience under pressure. The Ottoman Empire remained a formidable political and military entity, but the old systems that had fueled its early expansion were showing signs of strain. Understanding these internal challenges, military stagnation, economic disruption, bureaucratic inefficiency, and increasing external threats is essential to comprehending why the empire later embarked on ambitious reform programs. These would culminate in the Tulip era and the Tanzimat reforms of the 18th and 19th centuries, which sought to reinvent the empire in a rapidly changing world. Emerging from the turbulence and strain of the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire entered a distinctive cultural and political phase in the early 18th century that historians have come to call the Tulip era, 1718 to 1730, named after the widespread cultivation and celebration of the tulip flower, which became a symbol of elegance and cosmopolitanism. This era marked the first concerted attempt by the Ottoman ruling elite to engage with new ideas of reform and modernization while simultaneously indulging in a flourishing of arts, architecture, and diplomacy. The Tulip era was both a period of cultural efflorescence and a fragile political experiment, revealing the empire's desire to adapt to a changing world, but also highlighting the deep tensions between innovation and tradition. The political backdrop to the Tulip era was shaped by the conclusion of the Treaty of Passarowitz, 1718, which ended a costly war with Austria and Venice. Though the treaty left the empire's territorial integrity largely intact, it underscored the growing military challenges the empire faced from European powers. The new Sultan, Ahmed III, and his Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, were determined to avoid further debilitating conflicts by adopting a more diplomatic and reformist posture. Recognizing that the military and administrative systems required modernization, they sought inspiration from European models, especially the flourishing courts of Vienna and Paris. Ottoman elites began sending envoys and students abroad to study military science, architecture, and governance, initiating the first steps toward institutional reform at the heart of the Tulip era was an unprecedented cultural renaissance. The Ottoman court became a center of lavish parties, poetry, music, and refined taste. The tulip itself, exotic and delicate, was cultivated extensively in palace gardens and public spaces, symbolizing refinement and peace. This obsession with tulips permeated art, ceramics, textiles, and even poetry, where poets celebrated the flowers, beauty, and symbolic meanings of life and renewal. The period also saw advances in Ottoman architecture, with the construction of new palaces, fountains, and mosques that blended traditional Ottoman and emerging European Baroque styles, reflecting a more outward-looking cultural identity. This era's intellectual currents were equally vibrant. The empire's elite engaged in discussions about governance, law, and society, grappling with how to preserve Islamic traditions while embracing necessary innovations. There was a cautious opening toward secular sciences, technology, and printing. Technology previously resisted due to religious concerns, though the Ottoman authorities only allowed limited use of printing presses, often restricted to non-Muslim communities. Diplomacy flourished as well, with the Ottoman Empire actively participating in the complex balance of power politics in Europe. Embassies exchanged gifts, knowledge, and ideas, deepening mutual awareness even as rivalries persisted. Despite its cultural flowering, the Tulip era was marked by significant social and economic challenges. The lavish spending on court festivities, combined with rising prices and taxation, placed a heavy burden on the general population, particularly the peasantry and urban poor. Many conservative religious figures and segments of the military viewed the extravagance and foreign influences with suspicion, considering them decadent and un-Islamic. This tension exploded in 1730 during the Patrona Halal Rebellion, a violent uprising led by a disgruntled former janissary, which forced Sultan Ahmed III to abdicate. The rebellion was a clear signal that the empire's ruling class could not impose reforms from above without addressing the grievances of its diverse and often marginalized populations. Yet, the legacy of the Tulip era's reformist spirit endured beyond the rebellion. It planted seeds of modernization that would blossom more fully in the Tanzimat period of the 19th century. Early military reforms introduced new training methods and weaponry, and administrative experiments hinted at a more centralized and efficient state. The era also opened the empire to greater European influence in arts, science, and technology, slowly eroding the insularity that had marked previous centuries. In essence, the Tulip era was a moment of hope and contradiction, an empire caught between the allure of European progress and the realities of entrenched tradition and social unrest. It reflected the Ottoman elite's awareness that survival in the modern world required change. But it also highlighted how difficult such change would be in a society deeply rooted in centuries of established structures. The Tulip era set the stage for the more radical and comprehensive reforms that followed. as the empire struggled to maintain its sovereignty and identity in an increasingly globalized and competitive world. By the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire stood at a crossroads. The once vast and powerful empire was grappling with territorial losses, internal dissent, and the growing influence of European imperial powers pressing from all sides. It was against this backdrop of existential crisis that the empire embarked on one of the most ambitious and far-reaching reform movements in its history, the Tanzimat, meaning reorganization in Ottoman Turkish, spanning roughly from 1839 to 1876. The Tanzimat era was an attempt to fundamentally transform the empire's political, legal, military, and social structures in order to modernize the state, restore stability, and secure the empire's place in an era dominated by European nation-states. The Tanzimat reforms were formally launched with the proclamation of the Hatwai Arif of Gulhane, Etembarbai Senshajo, issued by Sultan Abdul-Mecid I. This edict promised guarantees for the security of life, property, and honor for all subjects, regardless of religion or ethnicity, a revolutionary concept in a multi-ethnic empire long organized around the millet system, which gave religious communities a degree of autonomy but also entrenched divisions. The Hatwai Zarif emphasized equal taxation, fair conscription, and regularized legal procedures, aiming to create a sense of citizenship based on loyalty to the state rather than religious affiliation. This was an effort to counter rising nationalist movements and European intervention justified under the guise of protecting Christian minorities. Legal reforms followed swiftly. The empire began overhauling its legal codes, introducing new penal and civil codes inspired by European models, particularly the French legal system. The creation of secular courts, Nizami courts, alongside traditional Islamic courts, marked a significant shift toward a dual legal system, where issues of state and public law could be addressed in modern judicial frameworks. These reforms also included the establishment of a new civil code, attempts at standardizing contracts, property rights, and commercial laws, which facilitated greater economic activity and integration with European markets. Militarily, the Tanzimat aimed to modernize the Ottoman armed forces by introducing conscription laws based on universal service, establishing military schools that incorporated Western techniques, and reorganizing the army's command structure. The empire invested in new weapons, fortifications, and naval vessels, often with European advisors assisting in training and organization. Although these efforts met with resistance from the Janissaries who had been abolished earlier in 1826 during the auspicious incident and conservative factions, the military reforms gradually helped to professionalize the armed forces and reduce internal factionalism. The Tanzimat also sought to improve the empire's infrastructure and economy. Investments in roads, telegraph lines, and ports aimed to connect distant provinces more effectively to the capital, facilitating trade, administration, and rapid military mobilization. Railroads, such as the famous Hejaz Railway, began construction to strengthen ties with the Arab provinces and counter European influence. These modernization efforts were financed through loans from European banks, which tied the Ottoman economy increasingly to global financial markets, but also led to mounting debts and economic dependency. Socially and politically, the Tanzimat reforms stirred profound changes. The promises of equality and citizenship generated hope among minority communities, Armenians, Greeks, Jews, and others who saw new opportunities for participation in public life. However, these reforms also provoked nationalist backlash, both within the empire and from neighboring European powers eager to exploit ethnic tensions. The empire's attempt to forge a unified Ottoman identity was challenged by growing nationalist movements that would eventually contribute to the fragmentation of Ottoman territories in the Balkans and beyond. The Tanzimat era culminated in the Ottoman Constitution of 1876, promulgated under Sultan Abdülhamid II. This constitution established a parliamentary system, guaranteed civil liberties, and attempted to balance the powers of the Sultan and the new legislative bodies. However, political instability, external pressures, and the Sultan's own authoritarian tendencies limited the constitution's effectiveness, leading Abdülhamid to suspend the parliament just 2 years later. Nonetheless, the Tanzimat reforms laid the foundational framework for the modern Ottoman state and foreshadowed later constitutional and nationalist struggles in the empire's final decades. In conclusion, the Tanzimat period was a bold and transformative chapter in Ottoman history. It reflected a desperate but determined effort by Ottoman leaders to modernize their empire in the face of unprecedented internal and external challenges. While the reforms achieved mixed results, improving administration and military efficiency but failing to fully resolve ethnic tensions or halt territorial losses, they reshaped the empire's legal and social fabric, setting it on a new path that would influence the late Ottoman and early Turkish Republican eras. The Tanzimat stands as a testament to the complexities of modernization in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire struggling to maintain cohesion amid the pressures of the 19th century global order. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Ottoman Empire faced mounting internal and external crises that would ultimately lead to its unraveling. The once vast and multi-ethnic empire was now besieged by rising nationalist movements, severe territorial losses, and political turmoil that exposed the deep fragility of its centuries-old imperial structure. This final century was marked by the empire's desperate attempts to maintain unity and sovereignty amidst the pressures of ethnic self-determination, imperial competition, and social transformation. The empire's demographic mosaic, which had long been managed through the millet system of framework that granted religious communities a degree of autonomy, now began to crack under the strain of nationalist ideologies spreading throughout Europe and the Middle East. Inspired by the successful nationalist revolutions and unifications in Europe, ethnic groups within the Ottoman domain increasingly demanded greater rights, autonomy, or independence. The Balkans, in particular, became the empire's powder keg. Populations such as the Serbs, Bulgarians, Greeks, and Albanians embraced nationalist aspirations that clashed with Ottoman central authority. These movements were not isolated. They were intertwined with religious identities, economic grievances, and the meddling of foreign powers like Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Britain, who supported nationalist groups to weaken Ottoman control. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 was a turning point, resulting in the empire's devastating defeat and the Treaty of San Stefano, which granted independence or autonomy to several Balkan states, including Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania, and created a large autonomous Bulgaria. Though the later Congress of Berlin revised some of these terms, the damage was done. The empire lost critical territories, and its prestige was severely undermined. These territorial losses continued into the early 20th century, culminating in the Balkan Wars 1991 to 1913, where the empire lost nearly all its European possessions except a small region around Istanbul. These defeats deeply humiliated the empire, destabilized the region further, and triggered waves of refugee migrations, straining the empire's social and economic fabric at the same time. Nationalist sentiments spread in the Arab provinces, where local leaders and intellectuals began advocating for reforms and autonomy within or even independence from Ottoman rule. The empire's traditional governance model, which had tolerated local autonomy under the millet system, was increasingly inadequate to address the demands of modern nationalism and pan-Arab identity. Rising Arab nationalism challenged the empire's control in regions such as Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Iraq, often fueled by resentment toward centralized Ottoman policies, economic hardship, and the influence of European powers with imperial ambitions. Internally, the Ottoman state was plagued by political instability and factionalism. The authority of the sultans, already diminished during the Tanzimat reforms and subsequent constitutional experiments, was further eroded by court intrigues, coups, and the rise of new political movements. The empire's ruling elite was divided between conservatives who resisted further reforms and progressives who sought to modernize the state to preserve its existence. This tension was exemplified by the rise of the Young Turks, a reformist group pushing for constitutional government, nationalism, and modernization forces that would soon dramatically reshape Ottoman politics. Economically, the empire struggled to cope with the costs of military defeats and administrative reforms. Increasing debts to European banks, coupled with disruptions caused by wars and nationalist uprisings, left the empire financially vulnerable and dependent on foreign influence. The Ottoman government was forced to grant extensive economic concessions and capitulations to European powers, limiting its sovereignty over trade, taxation, and infrastructure development. The social consequences of these upheavals were profound. Waves of refugees fleeing lost territories and ethnic violence overwhelmed urban centers, exacerbating tensions between different ethnic and religious groups. The empire's traditional social order was challenged by new political ideologies, economic inequalities, and the growing influence of modern education and media, which spread nationalist ideas further. Violence and repression against minority groups increased, culminating in tragic episodes such as the Armenian massacres in the 1890s, which foreshadowed even darker chapters to come. In essence, this period was one of deep crisis and transformation for the Ottoman Empire. Nationalism exposed the limitations of the old imperial order. Wars drained its military and economic resources, and political fragmentation undermined effective governance. Despite efforts to reform and modernize, the empire increasingly found itself caught between the forces of change sweeping across the region and the stubborn resistance of entrenched interests. These mounting pressures set the stage for the seismic political upheavals of the early 20th century, including the rise of the Young Turks, the outbreak of World War I, and ultimately, the empire's dissolution. As the 19th century waned, the Ottoman Empire found itself in desperate need of a new direction. The humiliating losses in the Balkans, the empire's political instability, and the growing threat of foreign domination created fertile ground for reformist movements that sought to rejuvenate the empire and restore its former glory. Among these, the Young Turks emerged as the most influential force, aiming to reshape the Ottoman state and society through a radical program of modernization, nationalism, and constitutional governance. Their rise marked a pivotal turning point, signaling the empire's final struggle to reconcile tradition with the imperatives of a rapidly changing world. The Young Turks movement was rooted in the Ottoman intellectual and military circles of the late 19th century, composed primarily of young officers, bureaucrats, and intellectuals educated in Western sciences, law, and political thought, influenced by European ideas of nationalism, constitutionalism, and secularism. They believed that the empire's survival depended on breaking away from autocratic rule and instituting a modern, centralized government with equal rights for all citizens. The movement's core organization, the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, gradually grew in power and influence, especially after it coalesced around the goal of restoring the suspended Ottoman Constitution of 1876. The catalyst for change came with the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, which forced Sultan Abdülhamid to reinstate the constitution and reconvene the Ottoman Parliament. This momentous event ended decades of absolutist rule and ushered in what is often called the Second Constitutional Era. The revolution was widely celebrated by various ethnic and religious groups, who hoped the new constitutional order would deliver justice, equality, and political participation. However, the empire's deep ethnic divisions and competing nationalist aspirations quickly posed challenges to the Young Turks' vision of a unified Ottomanism, an ideology promoting loyalty to the empire above ethnic identity. Despite these challenges, the Young Turks set out on an ambitious program of reform. They sought to modernize the empire's administrative and military institutions, improve education, and foster economic development. They promoted secularism, reducing the influence of religious authorities in governance and law. The CUP implemented conscription reforms, expanded railways and telegraph lines, and attempted to centralize authority to strengthen state control over the sprawling empire. Their efforts also included campaigns of Turkification, aiming to unify the diverse populations by promoting Turkish language and culture, often at the expense of minority identities, a policy that generated significant resistance and deepened ethnic tensions. Politically, the Young Turks faced numerous obstacles. The 1909 counter-coup attempt by conservative and religious forces, the rise of nationalist movements in the Arab provinces and the Balkans, and the assassination of political opponents revealed the fragility of the new constitutional regime. The Balkan Wars, 1912 to 1913, dealt a severe blow to the empire, exposing military weaknesses and causing further territorial losses. These setbacks forced the CUP to tighten its grip on power, often resorting to authoritarian measures, censorship, and political repression to maintain control. As Europe marched toward the First World War, the Young Turks were caught between conflicting pressures: the need to preserve the empire's territorial integrity and sovereignty, the desire to modernize and compete with European powers, and the reality of internal divisions and growing nationalist unrest. Their decision to align with Germany and enter the war alongside the Central Powers was a calculated gamble that would have catastrophic consequences. The war unleashed brutal campaigns on multiple fronts, including the Caucasus against Russia and in the Middle East, where Arab revolts further weakened Ottoman authority. The Young Turks' tenure was also marked by tragic episodes, most notably the Armenian Genocide of 1915 to 1917, where systematic deportations and mass killings of Armenians were carried out under the guise of national security. This dark chapter revealed the dangerous consequences of extreme nationalist policies and the empire's desperate attempts to control dissent and perceived threats. The genocide remains one of the most contentious and painful legacies of the empire's final years. In summary, the Young Turks represented the last major attempt to save the Ottoman Empire through reform and modernization. Their vision of constitutionalism, nationalism, and secular governance was groundbreaking but fraught with contradictions and limitations. While they succeeded in ending absolutism and introducing new political frameworks, their inability to reconcile ethnic diversity, manage nationalism, and avoid authoritarianism ultimately hastened the empire's decline. The Young Turks era set the stage for the tumultuous events of World War I and the eventual dissolution of the empire, profoundly shaping the political landscape of the modern Middle East and Turkey. As the world plunged into the unprecedented catastrophe of World War I in 1914, the Ottoman Empire found itself drawn into a conflict that would decisively end its centuries-long existence. The empire's entry into the war on the side of the Central Powers, primarily Germany and Austria-Hungary, was a strategic gamble fueled by hopes of regaining lost territories and asserting sovereignty in an increasingly hostile international environment. Yet this alliance, while promising military and technological support, ultimately exposed the empire's deep vulnerabilities, hastened its disintegration, and reshaped the geopolitical map of the Middle East forever. At the outbreak of war, the Ottoman Empire was militarily weaker than many of its European adversaries, but still strategically significant due to its control over key territories like the Dardanelles Strait and the Suez Canal. Early Ottoman campaigns included attempts to regain influence in the Caucasus against the Russian Empire and to hold back British forces advancing through the Sinai Peninsula and Mesopotamia. The Gallipoli Campaign 1915–1916 stands out as a dramatic and costly episode where Ottoman forces, under commanders like Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, successfully repelled an Allied invasion, boosting Ottoman morale and proving their resilience, despite overwhelming odds. However, the empire's military successes were limited, and many fronts deteriorated rapidly. The empire's economy was strained by the demands of total war, leading to food shortages, inflation, and widespread hardship among the civilian population. Ethnic and religious divisions intensified, with suspicion falling heavily on minority communities accused of disloyalty. The most infamous and tragic consequence of this climate was the Armenian genocide, where between 1915 and 1917, the Ottoman government systematically deported, massacred, and starved an estimated 1.5 million Armenians. This atrocity, now recognized by many scholars and nations as genocide, reflected both the brutal nationalist policies of the ruling Young Turks and the desperate paranoia gripping an empire on the brink of collapse. As the war dragged on, the Ottoman Empire faced mounting military defeats. The British, often working with Arab nationalist insurgents inspired by promises of independence, gradually pushed the Ottomans out of Arabia, Palestine, and Mesopotamia. The famous Arab Revolt 1916–1918, supported by figures such as T. E. Lawrence of Arabia, severely undermined Ottoman control in the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. Internally, the war exacerbated political tensions, food shortages, and social unrest, further weakening the empire's ability to govern effectively. By late 1918, the Ottoman Empire was exhausted, its armies in retreat, and its political leadership divided. The Armistice of Mudros, October 1918, marked the empire's formal surrender to the Allied powers, who quickly moved to occupy strategic territories. The post-war Treaty of Sevres, Ling, proposed the partitioning of Ottoman lands, carving out spheres of influence for Britain, France, Italy, Greece, and Armenia, and severely restricting the empire's sovereignty. This treaty was met with outrage by many Ottoman Turks and laid the groundwork for the Turkish War of Independence. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire during and immediately after World War I thus represented not only a military defeat, but also the disintegration of a centuries-old imperial order. The war exposed the limits of the Young Turks' reforms, the dangers of ethno-nationalist policies, and the vulnerabilities inherent in a multi-ethnic empire trying to survive in a world dominated by nationalist states. It also triggered massive population displacements, border redrawing, and new conflicts that would reverberate throughout the 20th century. In the aftermath, the Turkish national movement, led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, rejected the terms of the Treaty of Sevres, fought the occupying Allied forces and their proxies, and eventually secured recognition of Turkish sovereignty with the Treaty of Lausanne, 1923. This marked the official end of the Ottoman Empire and the birth of the modern Republic of Turkey, a secular, nationalist state that sought to break decisively from its imperial past. In summary, World War I was the final crucible that shattered the Ottoman Empire. It accelerated the empire's territorial dissolution, exposed its internal fractures, and led to one of the most profound geopolitical transformations in Middle Eastern history. The empire's fall closed a chapter on 600 years of Ottoman power and culture, but set in motion the complex legacy of nation-states, ethnic tensions, and political ideologies that continue to shape the region today.